On the 4th of May, 1903, Judge James B. Markham stood on the steps of the Breathitt County Courthouse. He was a man of the law, a symbol of order in a land that had forgotten the meaning of the word. A single shot echoed from a nearby window, sharp and final. The judge staggered back into his own courthouse and fell dead, a public execution designed to send a chilling message. In this corner of Kentucky, the only law that mattered came from the barrel of a gun. This was not an isolated act. It was a declaration of war in a place that had already earned its name, bloody Breathitt. Was this a county of savages, or was it a place where honorable men were locked in a desperate battle for the very soul of the mountains? The truth, as always, is far more complicated and far more terrifying. Today, we trace the story of how power, greed, and an ancient code of honor turned a quiet county into a battlefield. To understand the blood that was spilled, you must first understand the ground that soaked it up. Late 19th century Breathitt County was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of fog-choked hollows and ancient hills that guarded its secrets fiercely. It was a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, not by the clocks of a distant government. The people here were bound to the land and to each other by ties of blood and shared hardship. They were proud, self-reliant, and deeply suspicious of any authority that didn't carry their last name. The deepest scar on the soul of these mountains was the Civil War. Kentucky was a border state, a fractured land where loyalties were a personal and often fatal choice. In Breathitt, neighbor fought neighbor, and in some tragic cases, brother fought brother. When the official war ended, the fighting did not. Men returned home not to peace, but to simmering resentment. They brought their rifles with them, along with the grim knowledge that violence was a swift and effective way to settle a dispute. The old Union and Confederate grudges never truly died. They just became the fault lines for the family wars that would follow. This brutal history reinforced an older, unwritten law, the Code of the Mountains. In this isolated world, family was everything. It was your government, your army, and your only true safety net. An insult delivered to your cousin was an insult delivered to you, and it demanded an answer. Justice wasn't something you waited for a judge in a powdered wig to dispense. It was something you took yourself, often at the end of a path with a rifle in your hands. This wasn't seen as murder, it was seen as balancing the scales. This code was born of necessity. When your nearest neighbor is a mile away and the county seat is a day's hard ride, you learn to solve your own problems. A man's word was his bond, and his honor was his most valuable possession, worth more than his land, his livestock, or even his life. To have it challenged publicly was an unforgivable offense. It was this fierce, uncompromising sense of personal honor that would serve as the trigger for so much of the violence to come. Into this crucible of old wounds and rigid honor, a new element was introduced: progress, or what passed for it. Timber and coal barons from the north began to see the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be plundered. The railroad snaked its way into the hollows, bringing with it outside money, slick lawyers, and a lust for the region's vast natural wealth. Suddenly, control of the local courthouse wasn't just about settling local disputes. It was about controlling land deeds, mineral rights, and fortunes beyond imagination. This collision of worlds created the men who would fight the Breathitt County War. They were forged by the Civil War's lingering hatreds, governed by an ancient code of clan loyalty, and now tempted by a wave of new greed. They were men who believed their honor was worth dying for, and who were now being told that their entire world was for sale to the highest bidder. The storm was inevitable. Before the assassinations and the arrival of the state militia, there was a tense, fragile peace in Breathitt County. You have to imagine the town of Jackson in those days, a place of dusty streets and watchful eyes, where the future of the entire region was being decided not in an election booth, but in the quiet conversations held in hotel lobbies and general stores. It was a community living on a powder keg, but for a time, it was still a community. At the center of one world, was Judge James "Jim" Hargis. To his enemies, he was a tyrant, a corrupt political boss who ruled with an iron fist. But to his supporters, and there were many, he was the patriarch of Breathitt County. The Hargis Hotel wasn't just a building, it was the capital of an unofficial kingdom. On any given day, you could find Jim Hargis there, holding court. A farmer might come to him to settle a land dispute. A young man might ask for a loan to start a family. Hargis was the law, the bank, and the government all rolled into one. He understood the mountain people because he was one of them. He provided a kind of stability, a predictable order. It was his order, to be sure, but in a chaotic world, that was something. He had built a dynasty of power, and he aimed to protect it and the people who lived under his influence. On the other side stood men like Judge James B. Markham and Ed Callahan. They represented a different vision for the mountains. Markham wasn't a patriarch, he was a lawyer. He believed in the power of books, of precedent, of a justice that was blind and applied equally to all men, regardless of their last name. He saw the Hargis machine as a cancer, a corrupting force that kept Breathitt County trapped in a cycle of poverty and violence. He fought his battles in the courtroom, armed with legal briefs and righteous indignation, seeking to dismantle the little Tsar's empire from within. Ed Callahan was the embodiment of that same fight, but he met it on the streets. He was a respected and fearless lawman, a man who believed his badge should mean something. Where Hargis commanded loyalty through favors and fear, Callahan earned respect through raw courage. He was the man who would walk into a saloon to disarm a drunkard when no one else dared, the man who would serve a warrant on a known killer. He and Markham were the face of the Reform Party, and they were fighting for a future where a man's success depended on his merits, not on his allegiance to a political boss. For a while, these two worlds coexisted. The Hargis men would walk on one side of the street, the Callahan men on the other. Business was conducted, families were raised, and life went on under a veneer of civility. But everyone knew the peace was hollow. These were not just two political factions, they were two fundamentally different futures vying for control of the same small patch of earth. One side was fighting to protect the world they had built, the other was fighting to build a new one. Both believed they were in the right. And in the mountains of Kentucky, when two sides both believe they are right, the result is almost always bloodshed. But peace is a fragile thing, and in every great tragedy, there is a crack in the armor of the men who stand at its center. For James Hargis, that flaw was a pride as old and unyielding as the mountains themselves. His control over Breathitt County was not a political office, it was his birthright. He had built his world through sheer force of will, and he could not tolerate the slightest challenge to his authority. To him, opposition was not a difference of opinion. It was a declaration of personal war. This wasn't the hot-headed pride of a young brawler. It was a cold, calculating force. They say that years earlier, a merchant in town had dared to publicly support one of Hargis's political rivals. Hargis didn't send men with guns. He did something far worse. He quietly passed the word. The man's credit was cut off at the bank. His suppliers suddenly had trouble filling his orders. Friends who had known him for 20 years would cross the street to avoid speaking to him. Within a year, the man was bankrupt and broken, forced to leave the county in shame. Jim Hargis didn't just defeat his enemies, he unmade them. This absolute refusal to share or cede power was his great strength, and it would become the engine of the coming war. The fatal flaw of the reformers, of men like Judge Markham and Ed Callahan, was the mirror image of Hargis's pride. It was a rigid, almost naive faith in the power of the law itself. They truly believed that the system, if followed correctly, was strong enough to protect them. They believed that a court order held more power than a Winchester rifle, and that a properly filed indictment could bring down a king. They saw the corruption of the Hargis machine and believed they could dismantle it piece by piece with the tools of their trade: legal arguments, witness testimony, and appeals to a higher authority. When the threats against them began, whispered in the street, and delivered in unsigned notes. Their response was to seek injunctions and write letters to the governor in Frankfurt. They trusted in a process that Jim Hargis had spent a lifetime learning how to manipulate and control from the inside. They were honorable men trying to play by the rules in a game where their opponent had already burned the rulebook. This faith in paper and ink, in a world that still answered to lead and steel, would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. And so the stage was set. On one side, a man whose pride would not allow him to bend. On the other, men whose principles would not allow them to break. It was a collision of two opposing kinds of stubbornness, two incompatible definitions of justice. In the suffocating quiet of the Kentucky mountains, there was no longer any room for compromise. A single spark was all that was needed to make the whole valley burn. The spark finally landed in 1902. It wasn't a public argument or a contested election. It was the sharp, ugly crack of a rifle in the dark. The target was James Cockrell, the town marshal of Jackson. But Cockrell was more than just a lawman. He was Jim Hargis's right hand. He was the muscle that backed up the little Tsar's quiet orders, the walking, breathing symbol of the Hargis machine's control over the streets. When Cockrell walked by, people understood who was in charge. His authority flowed directly from the rocking chair in the Hargis Hotel. One evening, he was cut down from ambush. It was a classic feud-style killing, a shot from the shadows, with no warning and no chance to fight back. In the code of the mountains, this was more than murder. It was an act of profound disrespect. It was a message, written in gunpowder and blood, sent directly to Jim Hargis. It said, "Your man is not safe. Your power is not absolute. Your walls can be breached." For a man like Jim Hargis, whose entire world was built on a foundation of unshakable authority, this was the ultimate insult. His pride, the very core of his being, had been publicly challenged in the most brutal way imaginable. This wasn't a legal matter to be sorted out by investigators and juries. This was a personal attack on his house, his name, and his honor. The gears of the official law were too slow, too uncertain. The only justice that mattered now was the swift, terrible justice of the clan. The Hargis faction didn't wait for proof. In their minds, there was only one group with the motive and the audacity to carry out such an act: the Callahan-Markham reformers. The accusation was made instantly and publicly. The word went out through the hollers and across the ridges. The opposition had crossed a line from which there could be no return. They had spilled first blood. That single shot changed everything. It tore away the thin veil of civility that had covered the county's tensions. The conflict was no longer about politics or legal maneuvering. It had become a blood feud. The time for filing motions in court was over. The time for filing coffins had begun. The cycle of vengeance, that terrible grinding engine of mountain warfare, had been switched on. And once it starts, it doesn't stop until it runs out of bodies to consume. In the days that followed James Cockrell's murder, a heavy silence fell over Breathitt County. It was the silence of a held breath, the kind of quiet that comes before a lightning strike. The elders of the community, men who still carried the scars of the Civil War, saw the signs. They had seen this kind of storm gather before. Preachers took to their pulpits, pleading for peace. Respected old men, who owed allegiance to neither faction, went as intermediaries, their hats in their hands, begging for calm and reason. They warned that this was a fire that, once lit, would consume the innocent along with the guilty. These warnings fell on deaf ears. They went to the Hargis Hotel and spoke to the little Tsar himself. Jim Hargis would listen to them patiently, his face a mask of cold granite. He would offer them a drink, thank them for their concern, and then show them the door. In his mind, their pleas for peace were an insult. How could there be peace when his man lay in the ground, struck down from the dark? To compromise now, to let the matter be handled by a slow and corruptible legal system, would be a show of weakness. It would be an admission that his power, his very authority over the county, could be challenged with impunity. His response was not to de-escalate, but to tighten his grip. Known gunmen and loyalists, men like Curtis Jett and Tom White, began to appear more frequently on the streets of Jackson, their presence a silent promise of retribution. On the other side, the same desperate pleas were made to Judge Markham and Ed Callahan. Friends and family begged them to be careful, to leave town for a while and let the situation cool down. A living dog is better than a dead lion, they were told. But their own unbending principles made this impossible. Judge Markham saw it as his sworn duty to uphold the law, especially when it was under attack. To flee would be to surrender the courthouse and the very idea of justice to the forces of intimidation. He believed with every fiber of his being that the shield of the law was strong enough to protect him. Ed Callahan, a lawman to his core, refused to be intimidated. He continued his patrols, served his warrants, and walked the streets of Jackson as if nothing had changed. He rejected the idea of surrounding himself with a heavy guard, arguing that a sheriff who had to hide behind a wall of rifles was no sheriff at all. They put their faith in the system. They wrote letters to the governor detailing the threats. They tried to empanel a grand jury. They fought back not with guns, but with affidavits and legal motions, believing that the truth written on paper would ultimately prevail over the lies whispered in the shadows. Every attempt at peace became just another step towards war. When neutral citizens tried to form a committee for public safety, both sides accused it of being a front for the other. When the governor sent a tepid message urging a peaceful resolution, it was seen as a sign of weakness from the state, emboldening the hardliners. The town of Jackson was no longer a community. It was two armed camps staring at each other across a dusty main street. The path of compromise had vanished, overgrown with pride on one side and principle on the other. Every man in Breathitt County had to choose a side, and everyone knew that the talking was over. The air in Jackson had grown so thick with hate you could taste it. The threats against Judge Markham were no longer whispers. They were shouted in the street. His friends stopped visiting after dark. Notes were left on his doorstep, crude and clear in their meaning. The world was closing in on him, and everyone knew a final terrible line was about to be crossed. This was the moment for one last off-ramp, one final chance to turn back from the abyss. That chance came, as it so often does, in the quiet of his own home. The story goes that on the night before he died, his wife came to him, her face pale with a fear that was beyond tears. She begged him, not as a political figure, but as her husband and the father of her children. "James, let us leave this place," she pleaded. "Let's go somewhere the names Hargis and Callahan mean nothing. What good is the law if it leaves your children without a father?" It was the clearest choice a man could face. His duty on one hand, his life and family on the other. It was a direct plea to the man, not the judge. For a long moment, Markham was silent. He was not a fool. He knew the danger was not just real, it was imminent. He could see the logic in his wife's plea, could picture a life of peace far away from the blood-soaked soil of Breathitt County. He could have packed a bag, taken his family, and been gone by sunrise. No one would have called him a coward. They would have called him a sensible man who chose to live. This was the crossroads. He could choose to be a husband and father, or he could choose to be a symbol. But the judge's faith in the law was as unbending as a rod of iron. He looked at his wife, and with a heavy heart, he made his decision. If a circuit judge can be run out of his own courthouse by threats, he told her, then there is no law in these mountains. There is only the rule of the gun. And if that is the case, then our children have no future here anyway. I will not run. He believed to his very soul that to back down would be to hand a final victory to the forces of anarchy. He had to believe the system he served was worth dying for. In that moment, he consciously rejected the path of peace and fully committed to his tragic course. He sealed his own fate not with anger or pride, but with a quiet, resolute sense of duty. The conversation was over. The last chance for a different outcome had passed. He would go to the courthouse in the morning, as he had every other morning. He would stand on those steps and face whatever came. He had made his choice. The morning of May the 4th, 1903, dawned like any other. The sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Jackson. Inside the Breathitt County Courthouse, the air was thick with the familiar smell of old paper and stale tobacco. Judge James B. Markham presided over his cases, his voice calm and steady, a small island of order in an ocean of simmering chaos. When the day's business was done, he walked out onto the front steps, pausing for a moment to speak with a friend, the tension of the courtroom momentarily behind him. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, a sound, sharp and violent, cracked the afternoon calm. It was not a firecracker. It was a single, deliberate report that echoed off the brick buildings and sent a flock of birds scattering into the sky. For a split second, there was only confusion. Judge Markham felt a tremendous, invisible force strike him in the chest, a blow so powerful it staggered him backward and stole the air from his lungs. He looked at his friend, a question in his eyes, his mind struggling to understand what had just happened. He looked down. On the crisp white fabric of his shirt, a dark stain was beginning to bloom, spreading like a fatal flower. The abstract threats, the whispered warnings, the pleas of his wife, it all became real in that single, horrific instant. The long, complex legal argument he had been making against the powers that ran Breathitt County was over. A final, brutal rebuttal had just been delivered from a window across the street. His instincts, the instincts of a man whose entire life revolved around that building, took over. He did not cry out. He did not fall to the ground. With the last of his strength, he turned and stumbled back through the courthouse doors. He was a man of the law, and in his final moments, he sought sanctuary in the house of the law. He made it a few feet into the main hall before his legs gave out. Judge James B. Markham collapsed onto the hard wooden floor, his life ending at the very heart of the institution he had died trying to defend. For a long moment, nobody moved. The echo of the shot faded, replaced by a silence that was heavier and more profound than any noise. The people on the street were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock and terror. They had just witnessed the unthinkable, the public execution of a circuit judge on the steps of his own courthouse. It was an act of such brazen contempt for the law that it felt like the end of the world. This was not just a murder, it was a coronation. It was a statement, clear and undeniable, about who truly held the power in bloody Breathitt. The assassins, identified as Curtis Jett and Tom White, were known Hargis men. And the message they sent was simple and terrifying. No one was safe. No office was high enough. No principle was strong enough to protect you. The little Tsar's reign was absolute, and the courthouse itself was no longer a symbol of justice, but a tombstone for the man who dared to believe in it. From the dusty window of the building across the street, Curtis Jett and Tom White watched their handiwork unfold. The sharp, acrid scent of spent gunpowder hung in the still air of the room, a smell of finality. They saw Judge Markham stagger, saw him disappear back into the courthouse he loved. There was no panic, no rush of adrenaline-fueled fear, only the cold, clean satisfaction of a job well done. They were soldiers who had just successfully completed a mission for their commanding officer. Their next move was a testament to their chilling confidence. They didn't scramble to escape into the mountains. They didn't have a fast horse waiting in a back alley. They simply broke down the rifle, wrapped it in a cloth, and walked down the back stairs. They emerged into the pandemonium of the street, not as panicked fugitives, but as silent observers. They melted into the very crowd that was gathering in horrified knots, their faces as blank and unreadable as any other bystander. They were hiding in plain sight, protected by a shield of terror so absolute that no one dared to even meet their gaze. In the hours that followed, a strange paralysis gripped the town of Jackson. The body of Judge Markham was carried from the courthouse. The local law enforcement made a great show of securing the scene, of asking questions they already knew the answers to. Everyone knew who had pulled the trigger. The motive was as plain as the hole in the judge's chest. But who would dare to make the arrest? The town's legal system had just been decapitated, and the message was clear. Any lawman who tried to bring in Jet and White would be the next one to lie on a cold slab. And so, the killers did not run. They didn't have to. Later that day, they were seen openly in a Jackson store buying tobacco. They walked the streets with a new kind of swagger, the swagger of men who had proven they were untouchable. They were not fugitives cowering in the woods. They were conquerors, and the town of Jackson was their occupied territory. Their freedom in those first hours and days was the ultimate demonstration of Jim Hargis's power. The law was dead, and its assassins were calmly walking over its grave. The end of the road had not come for them. It had come for the rule of law in Breathitt County. The bullet that struck down Judge Markham didn't stop in the courthouse hall. It traveled onward, a phantom projectile that tore through the fabric of his family. For his wife, the abstract fear she had voiced just the night before had become a brutal, life-altering reality. She was now a widow in a town ruled by her husband's killers. His children were now orphans, their name a mark of defiance that placed them in constant, unspoken danger. The very community they had lived in became a prison of watching eyes and silent whispers. Friends who once greeted them warmly now averted their gaze, not out of malice, but out of a primal fear of being associated with the losing side of a war. For the Reform faction, Markham's assassination was a catastrophic blow. He was their legal champion, the man who believed he could slay the dragon with a well-aimed lawsuit. His death was the brutal answer to that belief. It ripped the heart out of their movement, replacing their hope for a lawful victory with the cold, hard reality of terror. A cloud of fear, thick and suffocating as mountain fog, descended on his allies. Men who had spoken boldly of reform now fell silent. The choice they faced was stark and immediate. Flee Breathitt County, bend the knee to the little Tsar, or pick up a rifle and answer violence with violence. The murder's ripple effect spread through the entire community. The town of Jackson became a place of profound paranoia. Shutters were bolted earlier in the evening. The streets, once a place of commerce and conversation, grew quiet and empty after dusk. Business between factions ceased entirely. A man's last name became his uniform, and the simple act of walking down the street was a declaration of allegiance. The courthouse, once the center of civic life, was now viewed with dread, no longer a house of law, but a monument to a failed idea. The assassination didn't end the violence, it guaranteed its escalation. The scales of justice, or what passed for it in the mountains, were now grotesquely unbalanced. Such a public and high-profile killing demanded an answer. The cycle of vengeance now required a blood payment of its own, and the Callahan faction, robbed of their legal path, began to see the gun as their only remaining option. The murder of the judge directly led to the murders that followed of the sitting sheriff and then of his successor, Ed Callahan himself. The tragedy of Judge Markham's death was not just his own. The wreckage left behind wasn't just a grieving family and a dead lawman. It was a shattered community, a broken faith in the idea of civilization itself. Jim Hargis had not just eliminated a rival, he had murdered hope. And in its place, he had enthroned fear as the one true king of bloody Breathitt. The murder of a circuit judge was an act so audacious it could not be ignored, not even by the distant state government in Frankfurt. The carnage in Breathitt County had become a national embarrassment. In 1904, the governor declared the county to be in a state of insurrection and sent in the militia. This was not a small detachment of men. It was an invasion force. Hundreds of soldiers armed with modern rifles and Gatling guns arrived on the train, marching through the streets of Jackson with fixed bayonets. They were a foreign army, sent to impose a foreign law. Their primary mission was to ensure that Curtis Jett and Tom White could be tried without the jury being intimidated or the courthouse being burned to the ground. The trial became a spectacle. The courthouse was no longer a public building. It was a military fortress. There were soldiers on the roof, a guard with a bayonet at every door. The proceedings inside were a perfect illustration of the clash between two worlds. The prosecution came with law books, eyewitness testimony from terrified citizens, and the complex machinery of the state's legal system. And on the other side sat Jett and White. They did not carry themselves as common criminals racked with guilt. They sat with a quiet, defiant arrogance, like captured soldiers being tried by an enemy tribunal. In their minds, and in the minds of their supporters, they had broken no real law. They had acted according to the ancient mountain code, loyalty to their chief. They had eliminated a threat to their clan and its leader. Their defense was not one of innocence, but of justification. They were merely the instruments of a will greater than their own, soldiers in a war that the men in powdered wigs could never understand. Outside the courthouse walls, Breathitt County held its breath, deeply and bitterly divided. To the Hargis loyalists, Jett and White were martyrs, loyal men being sacrificed to appease the Flatlanders in Frankfurt. They were symbols of resistance against an outside force trying to change their way of life. To the friends of James Markham and the shattered Reform faction, they were simply assassins. The trial was the last, desperate hope that the rule of law might mean something after all, that a killer could be held to account, no matter who he worked for. After weeks of testimony that kept the entire nation spellbound, the jury, protected by a wall of state rifles, returned its verdict: guilty. Both Curtis Jett and Tom White were sentenced to life in prison. The newspapers declared it a victory for justice. But in the hollows of Breathitt County, the question lingered. Was it justice? The trigger men were going to prison, but the man who had almost certainly loaded the gun and given the order, the man whose power they were protecting, James "Jim" Hargis, was never even charged. The law had proven it could cage the wolves, but it seemed powerless to touch the man who owned the forest. With Jett and White behind bars, you might think justice had finally, imperfectly, triumphed. But the other side of the coin was still in play. James "Jim" Hargis, the little Tsar, the man at the center of the storm, remained. The state militia eventually packed up their Gatling guns and went home. The trials were over, and Jim Hargis was still the king of Breathitt County. For years, he walked the streets of Jackson, a living testament to a chilling truth. The law could punish the soldiers, but it couldn't touch the general. He had won. He had broken the reform movement, eliminated his chief rival, and survived the full might of the state's intervention. But the mountains have their own way of balancing the books. The justice that finally found Jim Hargis didn't come with a judge's order or from the rifle of a sworn enemy. It came from inside his own house, from his own blood. In February of 1908, 4 years after the Great Invasion, a bitter argument broke out between Hargis and his son, Beach. We don't know for certain what it was about: money, power, a personal slight. But it was a fire that could not be put out. The very culture of violence that Hargis had cultivated to maintain his power had taken root in his own family. On a cold winter day, on a public street in the town he ruled, the final act of the tragedy played out. Beach Hargis confronted his father, and the argument ended the only way such disputes seemed to end, in bloody Breathitt. He pulled a gun and shot his father dead. The man who had orchestrated assassinations from the shadows, who had treated the county as his personal chessboard, was brought down not by the law or his political enemies, but by a simple, brutal family quarrel. There's a terrible poetic irony in his end. The state of Kentucky had failed to hold him accountable. The code of the mountains, which he had so expertly manipulated, was ultimately what destroyed him. He had lived by the sword of clan loyalty and died by the sword of a family feud. His death was not justice in the legal sense, but it was a grim and fitting final chapter for a man whose greatest legacy was the violence he left behind. With the little Tsar in his grave, put there by his own son, a strange and unfamiliar quiet settled over Breathitt County. The empire Jim Hargis had built through a lifetime of cunning and intimidation crumbled like a house of sand. There was no one to inherit his throne. The machine he had created was powered by his will alone, and without him, it ground to a halt. The name Hargis, once a word of power, became a whisper of shame, a cautionary tale of a man who ruled a kingdom and lost his own family. His descendants scattered, many leaving the county to escape the long, dark shadow of their name. On the other side of the ledger, the name Markham became something else entirely. It became a symbol of a lost cause, a ghost of what might have been. Judge Markham's family, seeking the peace he could not find for them in Jackson, eventually left the mountains. But they left his name behind, etched into the memory of the place. To this day, it stands for an honorable, if tragic, idea that the law should be something more than the will of the strongest man. But for the common folk of Breathitt, the years after were not about legacies. They were about survival. A profound and deliberate silence fell over the history of the feuds. It was a collective act of forgetting, a necessary amnesia. Fathers stopped telling their sons the stories. The names of the dead were still on the tombstones, but the reasons they were there were buried deep. To speak of the war was to risk reopening wounds that had barely begun to scar over, to reignite embers of hatred that still glowed in the dark. The community healed itself by cauterizing its own memory, choosing a future of silence over a past of pain. And into this silence, a new kind of power moved in. With the old patriarchs dead or disgraced, the county was left rudderless. The timber and coal companies from the outside no longer had to negotiate with a powerful little Tsar. They could now deal with a fractured, exhausted populace and a pliable local government. The great fight for Breathitt's soul did not end with the feuds. It had only entered a new phase. The rifle was put away, and the lawyer's briefcase took its place. The land and its wealth, which had been fought over with blood, would now be claimed with ink. The men who fought the Breathitt County War are long gone. Their rifles have turned to rust, their bodies to dust. But their story has not disappeared. It has seeped into the soil of the county itself, a permanent part of the landscape. And the most enduring echo of that bloody time is the name it earned, Bloody Breathitt. For more than a century, the people of this place have lived with that nickname. It clings to them like morning fog in the hollows, a ghost of a reputation they can never fully shake, a constant reminder of the time when their home was a battlefield. If you walk the streets of Jackson today, you can still touch the past. The old courthouse still stands, a silent brick-and-mortar witness to the murder that defined an era. And a persistent local legend says that the judge never truly left. On quiet nights, when the building is dark and empty, some people claim you can hear the faint sound of a man's footsteps, pacing the hall where Judge Markham fell. It's the ghost of a man who died for the law, still restlessly seeking the justice that was denied to him in life. Not far from there, in a quiet cemetery, you can find the weathered tombstones of Markham, of Hargis, of Callahan, their names worn by 100 years of rain and wind, the silent epilogue to a violent history. The story of the feuds is rarely found in official history books. It lives on in the way mountain people preserve their past, in stories told on a front porch, in hushed tones from one generation to the next. It has become a cautionary tale, a lesson taught to the young about the terrible price of pride and the destructive power of vengeance. The specific details may blur, the names may fade, but the core of the story remains. A warning about the darkness that can be unleashed when good men do nothing and powerful men do as they please. the spirits of the two main antagonists still haunt the county in their own ways. The ghost of Judge Markham is a sad one, a symbol of principle and sacrifice. But the ghost of Jim Hargis is something else entirely. It is the ghost of absolute power, of a time when one man's will could override all law and morality. He represents the old, untamed spirit of the mountains, both its strength and its terrifying brutality. Though the man is gone, his shadow, the memory of that kind of power, lingers as a reminder of what this place once was. So we come to the end of the trail and return to the question that started it all. Was this a land of savages or a place of honorable men locked in a desperate struggle? The truth is, it was both. There were no simple heroes or villains in the story of Bloody Breathitt. There were only men, forged by their time and place, and trapped by the very codes that gave them their strength. Jim Hargis was not a monster. He was a king from an older, fiercer world, a mountain patriarch who ruled by a law of loyalty and fear, and who defended his kingdom with savage brutality when it was threatened. And Judge James Markham was not a naive fool. He was a prophet of a new order, a man who believed that the rule of law could tame the wilderness and bring a just peace to the mountains. His tragedy was that he was a man ahead of his time, who fatally underestimated the violence with which the old world would resist its own death. They were two titans of two different ages, standing on the same small piece of earth, and there was simply not enough room for both of them. In the end, this is not just a story about a feud. It is the story of a painful, bloody transition. It's the story of what happens when the unwritten law of the mountains, a code of honor, clan, and vengeance, collides with the written law of the state. The gunshots that echoed through the hollows were the death rattle of an entire way of life, a brutal response to the encroaching forces of industry, money, and a government that the mountain people had never trusted. The blood that soaked the courthouse steps was the terrible price of that change. And that, my friends, is the Ballad of Bloody Breathitt. It is a grim and lasting reminder that a man's greatest strength can become his most profound weakness, and that when the old ways of a place are forced to die, they seldom die quietly. Imagine the deepest, darkest night in the Ozark Hills, where the silence is shattered not by a scream, but by the thunder of hooves. Riders emerge from the mist, but they are not men. They are terrifying figures in black hoods, with long, twisted horns sprouting from their heads, like demons clawing their way out of the very earth. The newspapers called them vigilantes. The outlaws called them monsters. But their neighbors called them something else, the bald knobbers. But here is the bone-chilling question history has tried to bury. What happens when the men who promised to save you from the darkness become the darkness itself? Today, we will separate the legends from the facts and find out what really happened when good men put on the devil's mask. To understand the firestorm that was coming, you first have to understand the land that would become its kindling. The Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri in the 1880s were a world unto themselves. This wasn't the manicured countryside of the East. This was a rugged, isolated land of deep hollows, limestone bluffs, and spring-fed creeks that ran clear as glass. It was a beautiful but unforgiving place, settled by fiercely independent Scots-Irish families who asked for little more than to be left alone to work their small farms and raise their children. Life here was governed by the seasons, not the clock. Men like Nat Kinney were pillars of this community. A giant of a man, a Union Army veteran with a booming voice, he was seen as a leader long before he ever took the title. You could find him at his general store, a place that smelled of coffee, leather, and kerosene, where he'd extend credit to a family down on their luck. You had decent, church-going folk, families who believed in hard work and the word of God, whose greatest dream was simply a good harvest and a peaceful night's sleep. But peace was a forgotten luxury. The Civil War had not been a distant conflict here. It was a brutal, intimate butchery that pitted neighbor against neighbor. The official surrender in 1865 meant nothing to the hills. The old hatreds didn't die. They just festered, waiting for a new excuse to bleed. The law was a ghost, a corrupt sheriff a full day's ride away who couldn't or wouldn't do a thing to help. In this vacuum, a new power had risen. A loose confederation of outlaws, horse thieves and murderers, led by the notorious Taylor and Matthews clans, ran Taney County as their personal kingdom. They mockingly called themselves the Anti-Law and Order League. For the ordinary farmer, life became a waking nightmare. Livestock vanished in the night, stores were robbed in broad daylight, and families were terrorized into silence. Every sunset brought a fresh wave of fear. Every knock on the door could be a gang of thugs demanding food or whiskey. The people were pushed to the absolute edge, praying for a savior. But they were about to learn a hard lesson. In the Ozark Hills, when you pray for a savior, you have to be careful what kind of angel answers your call. The roots of this conflict ran deeper than any single crime. They were anchored in the very bedrock of the Ozarks. The families who settled these hills, the Scots-Irish, didn't come here seeking gold. They came seeking freedom from kings, landlords, and any government that tried to put a bridle on them. They carved their lives out of the wilderness with an axe and a rifle, and the land they claimed wasn't just property, it was a declaration of independence. This patch of earth, this creek bottom, this ridge, it was a legacy paid for in sweat, heartbreak, and blood. To threaten a man's land was to threaten his soul. But the most poisonous memory, the wound that never healed, was the Civil War. Here, it wasn't a war of uniforms and battlefields. It was a war of ambush and arson, fought between neighbors. Pro-Confederate bushwhackers and pro-Union jayhawkers turned the Ozarks into a slaughterhouse. A man might see the neighbor he'd helped raise a barn with the year before, riding toward his home with a torch in his hand. The official surrender at Appomattox was just a whisper from a world away. In these hills, the war never truly ended. It just went quiet. The hatreds were passed down from father to son like a family Bible. The Anti-Law and Order League wasn't born in a vacuum. It was the direct descendant of the bushwhacker gangs. Families like the Taylors and the Matthews had ridden for the Confederacy, and they saw the post-war government as a hostile, occupying force. For them, robbing and terrorizing their old Unionist neighbors wasn't just crime. It was a continuation of the war. They were settling old scores that the history books said were already settled. In this land, a family name was a heavy thing. It was your history, your allegiance, and your honor, all rolled into one. To be a Taylor or a Matthews meant you remembered the wrongs done to your kin during the war, and you never, ever let them go unavenged. To be a Kinney, a proud Union veteran, meant you believed in order, in the flag, and in the idea that the war was over and the law should be respected. The coming storm wasn't just about crime. It was the ghosts of the Civil War rising from their shallow graves, ready to fight one last time. The ground wasn't just fertile for a feud, it was salted with the blood of the last one. In a place as small and tight-knit as Taney County, there was no neutral ground. Friendships that had weathered droughts and hard winters now fractured under the weight of a single whispered question: are you for Kinney, or are you against him? The general store, the church, the blacksmith shop, these weren't just places of commerce or worship anymore. They were listening posts where every word was weighed and judged. Siding with the outlaws could get your barn burned by reformers. Siding with the reformers could get your throat cut by the outlaws. The simmering conflict gave old grudges a new, deadly purpose. A fistfight over a stray hog 10 years prior was suddenly remembered. A bitter argument over a boundary line marked by an old oak tree became a justification for violence. Men who had simply disliked each other for personal reasons now found themselves on opposite sides of a brewing war, giving their private hatred a righteous banner to fly under. The chaos was a perfect cover for settling old scores, and everyone knew it. Whispers became the currency of the hills, and they were poison. A story told at the grist mill in the morning would be a full-blown death threat by the time it reached the far hollows at dusk. Rumors traveled faster than a man on horseback, twisting and growing with every retelling. Did you hear that so-and-so was seen sharing a drink with one of the Taylor boys? Did you hear that man's wife say she thought Kinney was going too far? In this atmosphere, accusation was as good as a conviction, and suspicion was a death sentence waiting to be carried out. And then, there were men like William Edens. He wasn't an outlaw. He hated the thieves and killers as much as anyone. But he was a stubborn, honest man who believed that justice delivered from the shadows was just another kind of crime. He spoke out, not in saloons, but in public, arguing that a secret committee of men acting as judge, jury, and executioner was a cure far worse than the disease. To Nat Kinney's supporters, this wasn't principled opposition, it was treason. Edens was marking himself and his family as an obstacle. He was a voice of reason in a world that was rapidly going deaf with rage. The community was no longer a community. It was a tangled web of fear, loyalty, and festering resentments. Every man was sizing up his neighbor, wondering which side he'd be on when the shooting started. The air itself felt heavy, charged with unspoken threats. It was a place holding its breath, waiting for the first man to reach for his gun. In the hollows, where old beliefs clung like moss to the north side of an oak, people felt the change in the air. The old folks would tell you the land itself was sick. They said the panthers cried with a human voice at night, a sound that meant blood was about to be spilled. A strange, unseasonable fog would roll in before dusk and refuse to burn off by morning, shrouding the hills in a ghostly silence. Women spoke in hushed tones of unsettling dreams, dreams of faceless riders and burning homes, of a darkness that had a shape and a name they couldn't quite speak. These weren't just superstitions, they were the collective dread of a community beginning to fracture under an unbearable pressure. The true omen, however, wasn't in the sky or the woods. It was in the eyes of Nat Kinney. The man who once offered easy credit and a kind word was gone. In his place was a figure of pure, righteous fury. His voice, once used for friendly greetings, now boomed with the fire of an Old Testament prophet calling down damnation. He was the human catalyst, the gathering storm cloud. When he sent word, man by man, for a secret meeting at the schoolhouse on that treeless hill, that bald knob, it wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. It was the moment the vague, simmering anger of the people began to sharpen into a weapon. On that cold night in 1885, as a dozen men slipped away from their cabins, their wives felt a knot of dread tighten in their stomachs. They saw their husbands clean their rifles, not with the calm focus of a man going hunting, but with the grim determination of a man going to war. They didn't know the specifics of the meeting, but they understood its nature. This wasn't about building a new fence or organizing a church social. This was about blood. They were trying to cast out the devil, but they couldn't shake the terrible feeling that to do so, their husbands were about to invite a whole new kind of demon into their homes. The shadow of what was to come was already falling across their doorsteps. Inside that cold schoolhouse, by the flickering light of a single lantern, Nat Kinney's voice was a clap of thunder. He laid out the nightmare they were all living, the stolen livestock, the terrorized families, the mockery of the law. He told them that if the government had forsaken them, then they would have to become their own government. If the law wouldn't protect them, they would become the law. That night, they swore a blood oath of secrecy and allegiance. They were no longer just a dozen angry farmers. They were an army. They were the bald knobbers, And an army needs an enemy to fight. They didn't start with the hardened outlaws. Their first target was chosen carefully, a notorious wife-beater, a man despised by the community but untouchable by the law. One moonless night, the silence of a lonely hollow was shattered by galloping hooves. The man was dragged from his bed, not by his neighbors, but by a circle of horned, silent demons. They tied him to a tree and whipped him raw with a hickory switch. They didn't speak a single word. When they were done, they melted back into the darkness, leaving him bleeding and terrified. It was a message, brutal and clear. There was a new power in the hills, a power that saw everything. The reaction was immediate. Decent folk, who had lived in fear for so long, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The whispers were no longer of fear, but of gratitude. Justice had been done. This success was like a drug to the bald nobbers. It emboldened them, swelling their ranks and hardening their resolve. They moved from punishing social outcasts to targeting the outlaws themselves. They burned down the corrupt saloons and gambling dens that served as the gang's headquarters, a direct assault on their power. The true point of no return came a few weeks later. A crude notice was nailed to the door of a known horse thief's cabin. It didn't have a signature, only a crude drawing of a horned mask. It gave the man and his associates 24 hours to leave Taney County. There was no negotiation, no trial. It was an ultimatum: leave or be found hanging from an oak tree. This was no longer about punishing a single sin. This was a declaration of war. The bald nobbers had taken it upon themselves to cleanse the entire county by force. The first drops of blood, drawn by a hickory switch, had been a test. Now, having found their power, they were promising a flood. The outlaws, for the first time, were scared. And a scared man with a gun is the most dangerous thing in the Ozark Hills. The war had begun. Power born from rage is a fire that eventually consumes the hand that wields it. The bald nobbers, once hailed as saviors, had begun to believe their own legend. Their enemy was no longer just the outlaw, it was anyone who questioned their methods. William Edens, the outspoken farmer who dared to call their shadow justice a crime, became the focus of their festering anger. On a cold night in 1887, they decided his voice would be silenced forever. This time, there were no ghostly horns, no pretense of demonic judgment. A large group of men, their faces bare in the moonlight, surrounded the small, isolated cabin. The pretense was over. This wasn't a warning, it was an execution. Inside, the Edens family and their house guest, Charlie Green, were asleep, unaware that their world was about to end. The first sound was not a knock, but a chorus of angry shouts from all sides, a predator's cry that left no room for escape. Then, the night exploded. It wasn't a single shot, but a deafening, continuous roar as dozens of rifles opened fire at once. The thin wooden walls of the cabin offered no protection. They might as well have been made of paper. The air filled with the shriek of splintering wood and the high-pitched shattering of the window panes. Inside, it was a hurricane of lead and splinters. The lantern on the table danced crazily from the impacts before its glass chimney burst, plunging the room into a terrifying darkness pierced only by the muzzle flashes from the tree line. Through the eyes of Edens' wife, it was a nightmare of incomprehensible chaos. She felt a searing pain in her own body as she fell. She heard a sharp final gasp from her husband, followed by the heavy, dull thud of his body collapsing onto the floorboards he had laid with his own hands. From the corner where their guest, Charlie Green, had been sleeping, there was a second thud, and then a profound silence. The attackers kept firing long after any movement inside had ceased, their fury needing to exhaust itself into the unresisting wood. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the shooting stopped. The silence that rushed back in was heavier, more terrifying than the noise. The only sound was the wind whistling through the new, ragged holes in the walls. The sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder hung in the air, thick enough to taste. It was the smell of murder. When the first rays of dawn finally crept into the shattered cabin, they illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The moonlight streamed through dozens of fresh holes in the walls, creating a horrifying constellation of death. There were no masks, no warnings, no hickory switches. This wasn't vigilante justice. This was a cold-blooded massacre. The bald knobbers had crossed a line from which there was no return. The heroes of the Ozarks were now just murderers. To the men who surrounded that cabin, this wasn't murder. It was a grim, necessary surgery. In their minds, William Edens was not an innocent man exercising his right to speak. He was a cancer. His words were a poison that threatened to undo everything they had accomplished. They had faced down killers and thieves. They had brought a semblance of peace to a land of terror. And now this one man, with his talk of process and law, was giving comfort to the enemy. He was making them look like villains, turning the very people they'd sworn to protect against them. Their logic was twisted but terrifyingly simple. If Edens turned the community against them, the outlaws would rise again, and the old nightmare would return. To save the county, Edens had to be silenced. The transformation from savior to killer had been gradual, almost imperceptible. It began the first time a man used his horned mask to settle a personal score. It grew each time they took a fine that felt more like extortion. The righteous fire had slowly burned down into the cold, hard ash of self-preservation. The switch flipped the moment they realized that Eden's arguments were working. The fear of losing control, of being exposed, arrested, and hanged by the very law they had replaced, became a paranoia that consumed them. The mission was no longer about saving Tiny County. It was about saving the bald knobbers from their own destruction. That is why they didn't wear their masks that night. This wasn't a symbolic act of justice. It was a personal, brutal act of elimination. But what did they feel as they walked away from that bullet-riddled cabin, leaving the smell of gunpowder and death hanging in the night air? There was no triumph. There was no righteous satisfaction. There was only a cold, hollow pit in their stomachs. The adrenaline of the firefight faded, replaced by the deafening silence of what they had done. They had just slaughtered a man in his bed, in front of his wife. They had become the very monsters they once hunted, night-riding killers who brought terror to the innocent. On the dark ride home, a few might have tried to justify it with hollow bravado, muttering it had to be done. But in the quiet of their own homes, alone with their thoughts, the truth would be waiting. The image of that splintered door, the sound of the glass shattering, the memory of the final heavy silence from inside the cabin. They hadn't felt like judges or executioners. They had felt like butchers. And in that chilling private moment of self-awareness, they finally understood. The horned mask wasn't something they wore anymore. It was something they had become. The silence that followed the gunfire was a living thing, a heavy blanket of horror that smothered the hollow. Inside the cabin, the cold night air began to creep through the dozens of new holes in the walls, carrying with it the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder and fresh blood. For what felt like an eternity, the only movement was the moonlight shifting across the floor, illuminating the two still forms and the splintered wreckage of a once peaceful home. But there was a survivor. Gravely wounded, drifting in and out of consciousness, was William Edens's wife. The pain was a fire in her body, but a colder, fiercer fire burned in her mind, the need to bear witness. She could not let them get away with this. She couldn't scream. Her lungs wouldn't obey. So she began to crawl, dragging her wounded body across the floor, past the body of her husband, out the shattered door, and into the freezing mud of the yard. Every foot was an agony, a testament to a will that refused to be extinguished by a volley of bullets. Her destination was the nearest neighbor, a lifetime away in the darkness. When the first neighbors arrived at dawn, summoned by the wounded woman's desperate gasps, they were met with a scene that would be forever seared into their minds. This wasn't the work of outlaws. This was something different, something more terrifying. The sight of William Edens, a good and honest man, lying dead on his own floor, turned the community's stomach. The awe and respect many had held for the bald nobbers curdled into pure, unadulterated horror. They hadn't just killed a man, they had murdered a neighbor in his bed. The news of the Edens massacre was a lit match dropped on a dry tinderbox. It traveled faster than any posse, a wave of shock and revulsion that swept through the Ozark Hills. The story was told in hushed, horrified tones at every crossroads and general store. They hadn't worn masks. They had shot the house to pieces. Mrs. Edens had survived. The killers' identities, long whispered in secret, were now spoken openly, names attached to an unforgivable crime. This was too blatant, too savage for even the corrupt local authorities to ignore. The flimsy shield of public support for the bald nobbers had been utterly shattered. The state was finally forced to act. The governor of Missouri, his hand forced by the public outcry, authorized the use of the state militia and hired the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency to hunt the killers down. A substantial reward was offered for their capture, turning friends into potential informants. The hunt was on, not just by a local sheriff, but by the full, vengeful power of the law they had so arrogantly replaced. The hunters had officially become the hunted. The murder of William Edens was not a stone dropped in a pond. It was an earthquake that split Taney County right down the middle. There was no more gray area, no room for neutrality. The invisible lines of allegiance that had been forming for months were now drawn in blood. You were either for the bald nobbers, believing they were the only thing standing between order and chaos, or you were against them, believing they had become a murderous tyranny. The question was whispered over fence posts, argued in hushed tones in the back of the general store, and sometimes settled with fists in the dusty street. Families who had shared pews for generations now glared at each other over the tops of their hymnals, the preacher's words about forgiveness ringing hollow and meaningless. The community, once a source of strength, was now a web of suspicion. Every shadow could hold a spy, and every friendly greeting could be a test. A conspiracy of silence fell over the hills, but it wasn't the silence of ignorance. Everyone knew who pulled the triggers that night. The killers were their neighbors, their cousins, the men they'd helped raise barns with. But to speak that knowledge aloud was to paint a target on your own family's door. Fear was a gag in the mouth of justice. In response to this new terror, an opposition finally took shape. They called themselves the Anti-Bald Nobbers. This wasn't a formal army, but a desperate coalition of the outlaws' families, old enemies of Kinney, and decent men who were simply horrified by the Edens massacre. The hills erupted into a full-scale guerrilla war. A bald nobber's barn would mysteriously catch fire in the night. An anti-bald nobber would be ambushed on a lonely road. Shootouts became common, turning the quiet mountain trails into killing grounds. Amid the terror, there were quiet acts of breathtaking courage. A neighbor, knowing the risk, would leave a basket of food on the porch of the surviving Edens family under the cover of darkness. Another, his conscience finally outweighing his fear, would slip away to meet with the Pinkerton detectives, his whispered testimony the first crack in the wall of silence. But for every act of courage, there was an act of cowardice. Men who knew the truth would provide false alibis for the killers, choosing the bonds of kinship or the safety of their own skin over the rule of law. The community was eating itself alive, and the war for the soul of the Ozarks had begun in earnest. The law that had been a ghost in Taney County for a generation finally arrived, and it arrived as an army. The state militia, disciplined and impersonal, marched into the hills, their blue uniforms a stark contrast to the greens and browns of the Ozarks. Alongside them came the Pinkerton detectives, quiet, observant men in city clothes who missed nothing. They weren't swayed by old loyalties, and they weren't intimidated by local reputations. They brought with them the cold, methodical logic of the ledger book and the arrest warrant. An unlikely and dangerous posse was formed. It was a volatile mix of state troopers, professional detectives, and the raw, vengeful fury of the anti-bald nobbers. For the lawmen, these local guides were a necessary evil, men who knew the secret paths and hidden hollows. For the anti-bald nobbers, this was their chance for revenge, now sanctioned by the state. They hunted their own kin, leading the militia to the doorsteps of men they had known their entire lives. The chase that followed was a brutal ordeal against the land itself. The wanted men were not fools. They were sons of these mountains. They knew every cave, every rock outcropping, every spring that could hide a man. They could melt into the dense woods like smoke. For the pursuing militia, many of them flatlanders, the Ozarks became a green hell of steep ridges, sudden drop-offs, and thorny thickets that tore at their uniforms and their resolve. Days turned into weeks of grueling patrols, of false leads and near misses. The mountains, which had been the bald nobbers' fortress, were now their last, desperate sanctuary. But the real weapon that brought them down wasn't the rifle, it was the whisper. The governor's reward money was a powerful temptation, but it was the presence of the militia that truly broke the spell of fear. For the first time, people who knew the truth felt safe enough to speak it. A farmer, his conscience gnawing at him, would secretly meet a detective and trade a name for a promise of protection. A woman, tired of the bloodshed, would leave an anonymous note detailing a hiding spot. One by one, the cracks in the wall of silence began to spread. The end came not in one epic firefight, but in a series of swift, merciless raids. Acting on the new intelligence, the militia would surround a cabin in the pre-dawn darkness, their rifles appearing like a thorny crown around the house. Some men were taken from their beds, blinking in confusion as the cold steel of handcuffs snapped onto their wrists. Others tried to fight, their defiance ending in a brief, desperate exchange of gunfire. A few, run to ground in a remote cave, simply gave up, their faces gaunt with hunger and the knowledge that the game was over. The once feared night riders, the horned demons of the hills, were rounded up by the dozens, their reign of terror ending not with a thunderclap, but with the quiet, final click of a jail cell door. The trials of the bald nobbers were not a quiet legal proceeding. They were the final battle of the war, fought not with rifles, but with testimony and lies. The entire county descended on the small town of Ozark, Missouri, turning it into an armed camp. State militia with bayonets fixed stood guard on the courthouse steps and at the doors, their stoic presence a thin wall against the seething tension in the streets. Inside, the courtroom was packed to the rafters, a stifling, airless space filled with the families of the accused, the families of the victims, and curious onlookers, all watching each other with a mixture of hatred and fear. The air was thicker than summer molasses, heavy with the unspoken threat that the violence outside could erupt within these walls at any moment. This was a clash of two worlds. In the dock sat the accused, hardened hillmen, their weathered faces looking utterly out of place against the polished wood of the court. Facing them was the machinery of the state, slick, confident lawyers from the city whose legal arguments felt like a foreign language in a place where disputes were settled with a handshake or a shotgun. Witnesses were called to the stand, their hands trembling as they swore on the Bible. You could see the terror in their eyes. As they spoke, their gaze would drift to the gallery, where the kin of the accused sat in stony silence, a silent but powerful reminder that after the judge and jury were gone, the mountains and their long memories would remain. Witness intimidation didn't require a single word, only a steady, unblinking stare. The defendants themselves showed no remorse. Led by Dave Walker and his son, they carried themselves not with the shame of murderers, but with the defiant pride of captured soldiers. They rarely looked at the judge or the jury. Their eyes were fixed on their own people in the crowd, a silent exchange of loyalty that defied the authority of the court. In their minds, they were being tried by a foreign power for an act of war, for executing a traitor who threatened their cause. They did not recognize this law, and they would not bow to it, even with the shadow of the gallows falling over them. The great captain, Nat Kinney himself, was not among them in the dock for this final judgment. He had a solid alibi for the night of the Edens murder and was acquitted in a separate trial, a legal technicality that felt like a dagger in the heart of true justice. The mastermind, the voice that had summoned the demons in the first place, would walk free. The state needed convictions, and it focused its full weight on the men whose triggers had been pulled that night. The jury, a group of terrified local men, deliberated under immense pressure, knowing their decision could make them heroes to one half of the county and targets to the other. Finally, they filed back in, their faces grim. The foreman stood, his voice shaking slightly as he read the verdict. Guilty. 4 men, Dave Walker, his son Bill, John Matthews, and Tubal Matthews, were sentenced to be hanged by the neck until dead. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room, followed by a single piercing sob from the Walker family pew. The condemned men did not flinch. They simply stood, their faces like granite, and were led away. The law of men had spoken. The gallows would have its due. But as the crowd shuffled out into the tense evening air, the question hung unspoken between them. With dozens of others who fired into that cabin walking free, with the leader of the whole movement absolved, was this justice? Or was it just a sacrifice, a few lives taken by the state to pretend that the war was finally over? On a bright spring day in May of 1889, a gallows was built in the town of Ozark. A crowd gathered, not to cheer, but to watch in grim silence as Dave Walker, his son Bill, John Matthews, and Tubal Matthews were led to the platform. The trapdoors fell, the ropes snapped taut, and the law of men had its final, brutal word. But for the Ozark Hills, this was not an ending. It was simply the beginning of a long and bitter reckoning. The great captain, Nat Kinney, had walked out of the courtroom a free man, but the Ozark Code of Justice he had unleashed had a long memory. In August of 1888, months before the hangings, he was standing in his own general store. His sworn enemy, Billy Miles, walked in, raised a shotgun, and fired. There was no fiery speech, no final plea, just the deafening roar of a shotgun and the thud of the giant falling behind his own counter. The man who had sought to bring his own law to the mountains died by that same law. For the dozens of other bald knobbers who were acquitted or never charged, there was no gallows, but there was a different kind of sentence. They returned to their farms to find themselves living in a prison without walls. They faced the silence of a neighbor turning his back in the street, the sudden chill in a once friendly general store. Their names were now a poison in the well of their reputation. Some found their crops failing, their livestock sickening, and whispered it was a curse. Others, unable to endure the shame and the constant accusing stares, simply sold their land for pennies on the dollar and vanished, their families swallowed by the westward migration. And what of the survivors? For Mrs. Edens, the woman whose will to live had brought the whole machine of justice down on the bald knobbers, there could be no peace in Taney County. Every ridge, every creek, every familiar tree held the ghost of her husband and the memory of that terrible night. The land was tainted. Soon after the trials, she and her family packed what little they had left into a wagon and left the Ozarks forever, becoming refugees from their own home. The creak of their wagon wheels on the dusty road was the sound of a final, heartbreaking goodbye. The community, ripped apart by the violence and the trials, did not heal. It simply scarred over. A thick, heavy blanket of silence was pulled over the whole affair. People stopped talking about it. The names Bald Knobber and Edens became words spoken only in hushed whispers. It was a shared, unspoken agreement to forget. The story was too ugly, the wounds too deep. They buried the history, hoping that if they piled enough dirt on it, the ghosts would eventually stay down. For generations, the official history of Taney County was a story with a missing chapter. But the past never truly dies. It just goes to ground. Today, the descendants of both the bald knobbers and the anti-bald knobbers still live in those hills. They are farmers, business owners, and teachers. But they carry a heavy inheritance. A name like Walker or Matthews still carries a faint echo of that old war, a history that is rarely, if ever, spoken of aloud. It's a private knowledge, a story kept behind closed doors, because in a place this small, the great-grandchildren of the hanged man might still live just down the road from the great-grandchildren of the men who hanged him. The physical traces are harder to find, but they are there for those who know where to look. The old schoolhouse on the Bald Knob is long gone, reclaimed by the woods. But the hill itself remains, a quiet, windswept place that feels different from the land around it. In the old cemeteries, you can still find the tombstones. There's the grave of Nat Kinney, the murdered captain, and not far away, the final resting places of the men who were hanged. The simple, weathered stones, with just a name and a date, give no hint of the firestorm that consumed their lives. The mountains have quietly swallowed the evidence, leaving only the ghosts. But the story refused to stay buried. In 1907, an author named Harold Bell Wright published a novel called The Shepherd of the Hills. The book was a sensation, one of the most widely read American novels of its time. In its pages, the raw, bloody truth of the Bald Knobbers was sanded down, romanticized, and transformed into a mythic tale of heroic mountain men fighting for justice. Wright turned the complex and brutal vigilantes into archetypes of the American frontier spirit. He gave the world a legend it could stomach, and in doing so, he cemented the name Bald Knobbers in the nation's memory forever. And then came the final, strangest chapter of their legacy. As tourism came to the Ozarks and the town of Branson began its transformation, the story was sanitized one last time. In the mid-20th century, a family of entertainers started a country music show. Looking for a memorable local name, they chose one that would echo through the hills, the Bald Knobbers Jamboree. Today, tourists clap along to fiddles and laugh at comedians, their family-friendly fun promoted by cartoon figures of men in horned masks. The terrifying night-riding demons of the 1880s have become a brand. The ghost was repackaged and sold, its bloody history washed clean for the sake of entertainment. But if you drive away from the bright lights of the Branson Strip, back into the deep, dark hollows on a moonless night, and turn off your engine, you can still feel it. A silence so deep it feels ancient. And in that silence, you can almost hear the whisper of the wind through the oak trees. People may have forgotten, the novel may have romanticized, and the show may have sanitized. But the mountains remember everything. So we return to the question we asked in the beginning, in the cold, misty dark of the Ozark Hollows. What happens when the men who promise to save you from the darkness become the darkness itself? The story of the Bald Knobbers gives us a chilling and timeless answer. It tells us that the line between a savior and a tyrant is terrifyingly thin, a line drawn not in the dirt, but inside the human heart. It shows us that justice, when stripped of process and mercy, is no longer justice. It is merely vengeance with a righteous name. This is more than just a forgotten tale from the Missouri hills. It is a profoundly American tragedy, a cautionary tale written in blood. It is a story about the indomitable frontier spirit, that fierce, independent streak that demands order in a chaotic world. But it is also a warning about the terrible danger of that same spirit when it becomes convinced of its own infallibility, when good men decide that their rage is the only law that matters. The law may be slow, it may be flawed, and it may sometimes fail us. But the Bald Knobbers stand as a grim, horned monument to the fact that the alternative is a far more terrifying monster. Their story is a lesson that was paid for with lives, with a community torn apart, and with ghosts that still linger in the deep woods. A lesson that the masks we wear to fight monsters have a way of sticking to our skin, and that the abyss when stared into for too long, always stares back. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. When the gun smoke cleared over the Tugfork River, one Hatfield lay dead on the ferry landing, put there by another. The killer wasn't some long-hated McCoy. He was the law itself, Sheriff Bud Hatfield, and the man bleeding out in the dirt was his own cousin. This single act raises a chilling question that echoes through the hollows to this day. How does a man forged in the fires of the Hatfield feud, a clan that valued blood above all else, bring himself to kill his own family for a tin star? The newspapers of the day called it justice. But those who lived in the shadows of the mountains whispered a different story. A story of a kinslayer, a man who made a deal with the devil, a traitor who sold his soul. Today, we will separate the facts from the folklore to find the truth behind the most feared and complicated lawman in Appalachian history. To understand the man, you have to understand the silence that fell after the storm. By the turn of the 20th century, the great Hatfield-McCoy feud was over. The shooting had mostly stopped. The famous raids were now just stories told to wide-eyed children. But the peace was a fragile, wounded thing. It was a land of long memories and short tempers, where a man's last name was more important than any law written in a book. The Tugfork Valley was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of creeks and hollows where families lived by codes carved into their very bones over generations. Justice wasn't found in a courthouse. It was settled in a cornfield, on a riverbank, or at the dark end of a lonely mountain path. In this world of simmering grudges lived William Anderson Hatfield, known to all as Bud. He was not a patriarch like his famous cousin, Devil Anse. He was a younger man, molded by the feud's final bloody years. He had seen the cost of hot-blooded pride firsthand. While his kin were known for their booming laughs and explosive tempers, Bud was different. He was quiet, watchful. He moved through the woods not like a man, but like a shadow, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't boast of his skill with a pistol. He simply practiced, hour after hour, until the Colt revolver felt like an extension of his own hand. He learned the mountains as a hunter, but he wasn't just tracking deer. He was learning how men think when they're being hunted, where they hide when they're scared, and the fatal mistakes they make when they believe they're safe. He was absorbing the brutal lessons of the feud, not as a brawler, but as a student of violence. He was a weapon being forged in the quiet aftermath of a war, waiting for a purpose. His world was one of clan loyalty, where the only thing that mattered was protecting your own, no matter the cost. But a new sound was beginning to echo through the mountains, a sound louder than a rifle shot. It was the chugging of steam engines and the grinding of machinery. Coal companies with their fat checkbooks and their armies of private detectives from agencies like Baldwin Felts were pushing their way into the hills. They saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be cracked open. They brought with them a new kind of law, corporate law, and they had no patience for the old ways of the clans. The world that had created Bud Hatfield was about to be devoured, and he would soon have to make a choice that no Hatfield had ever faced. The conflict that would define Bud Hatfield's life didn't begin with a single gunshot. Its seeds were planted generations before, deep in the rocky Appalachian soil. The Hatfields, like many of the Scots-Irish families who first dared to cross the mountains, carved a kingdom for themselves, not with a pen and a deed, but with an axe and a long rifle. This land wasn't just property. It was their lifeblood, their fortress, and their identity. They owed allegiance to no distant government. They were kings of their own hollows, and they held their land with a fierce, possessive grip that outsiders could never understand. The deepest scar on this landscape was the Civil War. While the nation tore itself apart, the borderlands between West Virginia and Kentucky became a brutal theater of guerrilla warfare. The Hatfields were fiercely Confederate, seeing the Union as an invading force trying to impose its will upon them. Devil Anse himself led a band of irregulars, the Logan Wildcats, who fought a vicious war in the hills long after the main armies had gone home. They weren't just fighting for a political cause, they were fighting for their own sovereignty against any and all outside control. This deep-seated division bled directly into the Hatfield-McCoy feud. At its heart, it was a continuation of the war on a more personal scale, with the largely Confederate Hatfields pitted against the largely Unionist McCoys. The conflict was fueled by old loyalties and betrayals that the rest of the country was trying to forget. For these families, the war never ended. It simply smoldered under the surface, waiting for any spark, a stolen pig, a forbidden romance, to erupt into a full-blown inferno. In this world, a family name was everything. It was a heavy cloak of obligation and pride worn from birth. And to be a Hatfield meant you lived by an unwritten, unbreakable code. It meant you stood by your kin, right or wrong. It meant you settled your own scores, answered insults with your fists or your gun, and never backed down from a fight. Above all, it meant you never, ever turned to an outside lawman for justice, and you certainly never became one. The law was the enemy, the outsider, the threat to the clan's power. This was the legacy Bud Hatfield was born into, a legacy of fierce independence, deep suspicion, and a sworn duty to put blood before all else. The end of the feud didn't bring unity. It left a vacuum. With no common enemy to fight, the old clans began to turn on themselves. The Tugfork Valley became a tangled web of personal slights and simmering resentments. The supporting cast wasn't just Hatfield and McCoy anymore. It was the Hatfields who sold timber rights to the coal companies versus the Hatfields who refused. It was the families who wanted schools and roads versus the families who saw every change as an invasion. It was a community teetering on a knife's edge, where everyone was watching everyone else, waiting for the first sign of weakness or betrayal. At the center of the old guard's resistance was Bud's own cousin, another Elias Hatfield, but this one went by a different name, Bad Lias. He was everything the old Hatfields were supposed to be, wild, violent, and utterly contemptuous of any law but his own. He drank, he brawled, and he took what he wanted. While Devil Anse was growing old and making calculated deals with the coal barons, Bad Lias was a living, breathing reminder of the clan's lawless past. He was a festering wound, a source of both pride and shame for the family, and his violent exploits kept the old animosities burning bright. The air itself grew thick with gossip. On the porch of the general store, men would speak in low tones about which Hatfield was seen talking to a Baldwin Felts man. Women would whisper over their washboards, speculating on who was behind a mysterious fire that burned a small logging operation. The McCoys and their allies, though quiet, were watching with hungry eyes. They saw the cracks forming in the great Hatfield dynasty and knew that a house divided against itself could not stand. Every fistfight, every land dispute, every drunken threat was fuel for a fire that had never truly been extinguished. This was a world where suspicion was a survival tool. A friendly wave from a man whose grandfather fought for the Union might be a genuine greeting, or it might be a trick to get a better look at the rifle you were carrying. A business deal gone sour wasn't a civil matter. It was a mortal insult that could lead to an ambush on a lonely stretch of road. It was a poison that seeped into the wells, turning neighbor against neighbor and cousin against cousin. The community wasn't healing. It was rotting from the inside out with paranoia and fear. And into this poisonous air, a new rumor began to spread, one more unbelievable than all the others. That Bud Hatfield, the quiet one, the dead shot, was thinking of doing the unthinkable. In the months before Bud Hatfield pinned on his badge, the old folks said the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. The air went still and heavy, the way it does before a lightning strike tears the sky open. A hoot owl, that feathered messenger of death, was heard crying in broad daylight near the Hatfield family graveyard. Men hunting deep in the woods came back with stories of feeling unseen eyes on their backs, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the bears or panthers that roamed the hills. The very land seemed to be sending a warning, whispering through the rustling leaves that the old world was dying and its ghost would not go peacefully. The human omen was far less subtle. Strangers began appearing in the hollows, men with clean hands and cold eyes, carrying surveyors' transits and leather briefcases full of contracts. They were the agents of the coal and timber companies, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They spoke of progress and prosperity, but their eyes measured the ancient trees in bored feet and sized up the family homesteads by the tons of coal that lay beneath them. Their presence was a constant, grating reminder that the outside world was no longer content to leave the mountains alone. They were a walking, talking prophecy of a new kind of war, one fought not with rifles over family honor, but with lawyers and hired guns over mineral rights. Bud Hatfield, a man who read the woods better than any book, felt this change in his gut. It was a coiled tightness in the air, a new kind of fear in the eyes of his neighbors. He saw men who had once been proud and defiant, now speaking in hushed tones, worried about losing the very land their grandfathers had bled for. He saw the easy smiles of the company men and recognized the look of a predator sizing up its prey. He felt a deep, chilling premonition that the old Hatfield code of settling their own problems and protecting their own kin was no longer enough. It was a code designed for fighting other mountain men, not for fighting a corporation with limitless money and its own private army. Something terrible was coming, and Bud knew, with the certainty of a hunter sensing a shift in the wind, that he was standing directly in its path. The law in Logan County had become a ghost. It haunted the courthouse, but it held no power in the hollows. The chaos that Bud Hatfield had foreseen was no longer a distant storm. It was a flood. Drunken brawls turned into shootouts in broad daylight. Payrolls for the coal mines were robbed on the open road. Witnesses to crimes would suddenly lose their memory, their silence bought by a quiet threat delivered on their doorstep in the dead of night. The old system of clan justice was crumbling, and the new corporate law of the Baldwin Felts agents was nothing more than organized brutality, serving only the interests of the coal barons. The county was bleeding, and there was no one to stop it. It was in this desperate atmosphere that the county officials made their move. They needed a man who could not be intimidated, who knew the mountains and the mindset of the men who haunted them. They needed a man who was feared more than the outlaws themselves. And so, they came to the one man who fit that description perfectly. They came to Bud Hatfield. The offer was laid on the table, a deputy's badge. It wasn't a job offer, it was a plea. They weren't asking him to be a peacekeeper. They were asking him to be a hunter, a one-man army who could walk into the darkest hollows and drag the violence out into the light. For Bud, this was the moment the world stopped. To accept the badge was to turn his back on everything he had ever known. It was a declaration that the code of the Hatfields, the sacred bond of blood, was no longer his law. He was choosing the law of strangers over the blood of his grandfather. He looked at the chaos around him, at men like his cousin Bad Lears, who were becoming rabid dogs, and at the cold-eyed company thugs who were no better. He saw two paths leading to the same ruin, and in that moment he chose a third. With a steady hand, he reached out and took the small piece of tin. He pinned it to his chest. The word spread through the hollows like a pestilence. A Hatfield was the law. To his family, it was the ultimate betrayal. Whispers of traitor followed him like a shadow. Uncles and cousins who had known him since birth now looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. The community was instantly and violently divided. You were either for the old ways or you stood with the kinslayer. There was no middle ground. This was the first drop of blood. It wasn't spilled by a bullet, but by an oath. By pinning on that badge, Bud Hatfield had drawn a line not on a map, but through the heart of his own family. From that moment on, he was no longer just Bud Hatfield. He was Deputy Hatfield. And for men like his cousin, Bad Lears, who saw the badge as a declaration of war, it made him a target. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The confrontation was inevitable, and it happened, as so many things in that country do, by the river. Bud Hatfield and his posse cornered his cousin, Bad Lias, at the ferry landing. The water of the tug fork was slow and brown, the air thick with tension. It wasn't a long standoff. There were no grand speeches. There was only the low, steady voice of Sheriff Hatfield ordering his own blood to surrender, and the wild, defiant laugh of Bad Lias in response. For a moment, the two men stood as living symbols of the two worlds colliding, the old, lawless clan and the new, iron-willed law. What happened next took less time than a single breath, but the silence it created would last forever. There was no Hollywood gunfight, no men diving for cover. There was only a sudden, blurred movement, and then the calm was shattered by a deafening roar that echoed off the water and slammed into the hills. It was followed almost instantly by a second shot, so close to the first they sounded like a single stuttered clap of thunder. The posse froze, their own guns still in their holsters. When the sharp, acrid smell of gun smoke cut through the damp air, Bad Lias was no longer standing. He was on his knees, his head bowed, looking not at his cousin, but down at the wooden planks of the landing. He stayed that way for a single, long second, a statue of defeat. Then, without a sound, he simply pitched forward, his fall making a dull, hollow thud that seemed shockingly loud in the sudden quiet. From across the river, a person would have seen almost nothing. Just two men facing each other, a puff of white smoke quickly stolen by the breeze, and then one man falling. They would not have seen any blood. They would only have seen a dark stain begin to slowly spread across the back of the fallen man's shirt, like a shadow growing in the afternoon sun. The true horror wasn't in the wound, but in the stillness that followed. Bud Hatfield walked forward, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the ferry landing. He stood over the body of his kinsman, his own pistol still smoking in his hand. The pearl handle, they say, felt as cold as a river stone against his palm. He did not speak. He did not offer a prayer. He simply looked down at what the law had required of him. Members of the posse would later whisper that the most terrifying part was the look in Sheriff Hatfield's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't remorse. It was a chilling, empty calm, the look of a man who had just performed a necessary but terrible piece of work. A Hatfield had killed a Hatfield. In that moment, the old world of clan justice didn't just die. It was executed on a riverbank by one of its own sons. To understand what went through Bud Hatfield's mind on that ferry landing, you must first understand that he likely didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a surgeon. In his cold, calculated view, his cousin, Bad Lias, wasn't a man anymore. He was a disease. He was the living embodiment of the chaos and violence that was strangling the mountains, the very sickness that Bud had sworn an oath to cure. His twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. To save the body, you must cut out the cancer. In that moment, the bond of blood was meaningless. It was an old-world sentiment that had no place in the new order he was trying to build. He wasn't executing his cousin. He was executing a problem. The true transformation didn't happen in the flash of gunfire. It happened in the quiet moment he first pinned the badge to his chest. That act was a silent vow to kill the part of himself that was a Hatfield clansman. He had to consciously sever the ties of blood and tradition that had defined his entire life. To become Sheriff Hatfield, Bud Hatfield, the cousin, had to die. So when Bad Lias made his move, there was no internal struggle. There was no hesitation. The switch had been flipped months ago. He was no longer acting as a man, but as an instrument of the law he had chosen to serve, and instruments do not feel conflict. As he drew his pistol, the world would have narrowed to a single point, the threat in front of him. His years of relentless practice took over, his mind becoming a place of chilling calm. There was no anger, no hatred, not even a flicker of sadness for the boy he once knew. There was only a target, a distance, and a trigger to be pulled. It was the detached, predatory focus of a hunter, but his prey was his own family. He was operating on a level of pure, brutal efficiency that few men could comprehend, let alone achieve. And afterward, standing in the gun smoke over his cousin's body, he would not have felt triumph or relief. He would have felt a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, the silence of a void created where something used to be. He had proven his loyalty to the law, but the price was a piece of his own soul. He had become what the county needed him to be, a monster to hunt monsters, but in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own kin and perhaps even to himself. The legend of the fearless lawman was born in that moment, but so was the ghost of the kinslayer that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The silence that fell on the ferry landing was heavier than a tombstone. Bud Hatfield's posse stood frozen, men who had seen their share of violence now stunned into stillness, not by the death, but by the identity of the killer and the killed. Sheriff Hatfield broke the spell. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if he were cataloguing supplies. He gave orders to secure the body and retrieve his cousin's weapon. He treated the scene with the cold, methodical procedure of a man clearing away a fallen tree from a road. There was no room for grief or hesitation. The law had been served, and now the paperwork had to follow. The body of Bad Lias was brought back to town, laid out on the back of a wagon. That grim procession was the only announcement needed. The news didn't travel by wire. It moved like a ghost, whispered from porch to porch, from one hollow to the next. A Hatfield has killed a Hatfield. The words carried a terrible weight, a sacrilege against the deepest code of the mountains. It was a wound cut into the very soul of the clan, a wound that would fester and poison everything it touched. For the Hatfield family, it was a moment of profound and terrible clarity. The lines were drawn. Doors that had always been open to Bud were now silently, permanently barred. Eyes that once held kinship now held a cold, hard judgment. They did not raise their guns against him, not yet. Their reaction was a silence more menacing than any threat. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, a tool of the very government they had fought for generations. He was a kinslayer. In the eyes of his own blood, his badge was not a symbol of honor, but the brand of a traitor. The official reaction was the polar opposite. The county prosecutor reviewed Bud's report, a document as blunt and efficient as the man who wrote it. It was a lawful killing. Bad Lias had resisted arrest. He had drawn his weapon. The men of the posse, shaken but loyal to their sheriff, corroborated the story. The officials who had hired Bud let out a collective sigh of relief. They had unleashed a force of nature, and it was working. He had done the unthinkable, the very thing no one else had the stomach to do. They saw a hero, a man bringing order through righteous, necessary violence. His power was solidified, his legend cemented in the halls of the courthouse. But for Bud, the hunt was just beginning. It was not a hunt for another outlaw, but a lifelong hunt for a peace he would never find. He had made his choice, and now he had to live in the world he had created, a world where he was feared by all and trusted by none. The ashes of his old life were all around him, the family he had forsaken, the traditions he had shattered. He was the law, but he was utterly alone, a solitary figure standing in the chilling silence that follows the final, fatal shot. The killing of Bad Lias split the county like a bolt of lightning hitting a 100-year-old oak. There was no middle ground left, no place for neutrality. Every single person, from the coal baron in his fine house to the farmer scratching a living from a rocky hillside, was forced to choose. The general store became a silent battlefield. A man's loyalty could be judged by who he tipped his hat to and whose gaze he avoided. A woman buying flour would fall silent if a known supporter of the sheriff walked in, the friendly chatter dying as if a cold wind had blown through the room. It was a war fought with averted eyes, tight-lipped smiles, and doors that suddenly wouldn't open. An unspoken conspiracy of silence descended upon the hills. Many knew the official story of the shooting was too clean, too simple. They'd heard whispers of a different tale, that Bad Lias was trying to surrender, that the second shot was unnecessary. But who would dare say so? To speak against Sheriff Hatfield was to invite a visit in the dead of night. People who had once been proud and outspoken now looked at their own children and chose to hold their tongues. Fear was a more effective lawman than Bud Hatfield could ever be, and it kept the community locked in a state of terrified paralysis. The truth, whatever it was buried alive under the weight of that silence. But even in the deepest fear, there were small acts of courage and cowardice that revealed the true heart of the people. A merchant, once a friend of Bad Lias, now made a point to give Sheriff Hatfield a discount, a public display of his newfound allegiance. A preacher, caught between his fear of the lawman and his fear of God, delivered a sermon on the sin of Cain that was so full of careful, veiled language that both sides could claim it as their own. Then there were the quiet acts of defiance. An old woman from a distant branch of the Hatfield family walked 10 miles to lay a single wildflower on Bad Lias's unmarked grave. A miner, his face black with coal dust, was heard to mutter "Kinslayer" as Bud rode past, a single word of rebellion that could have cost him his life. And the McCoys, the old enemies, they said nothing at all. They just watched, their silence one of grim satisfaction as their great rival, the House of Hatfield, began to devour itself from within. The death of Bad Lias was not an end. It was a declaration. With that single act, Sheriff Bud Hatfield had served notice to every outlaw, moonshiner, and hot-blooded brawler in the county. The old ways were over. His posse was no longer made of Hatfield cousins riding to defend the clan's honor. It was a new breed of man. They were young, grim-faced deputies who owed their loyalty not to a family name, but to the paycheck and the terrifying man who signed it. They followed him into the darkest hollows, not out of camaraderie, but out of a deep-seated fear of what he would do to them if they refused. They knew they were not his kin. They were his tools. The hunt for fugitives under Sheriff Hatfield became a new kind of Appalachian horror story. He didn't send his deputies, he led them. And when he went into the mountains, he was no longer a lawman. He was a predator returning to his natural habitat. The very skills the feud had taught him, how to track a man through dense rhododendron thickets, how to read a footprint in a creek bed, how to move through the woods without making a sound, were now turned against the very people who lived by that same code. The mountains that had for generations served as a fortress for the clans, hiding them from the outside world, had now become Bud Hatfield's personal hunting preserve. When a warrant was issued, a chilling game of cat and mouse began. The fugitive would run to the hills, believing himself safe in the familiar terrain. But he wasn't just being chased, he was being stalked. Bud was relentless, a force of nature that did not sleep or tire. Men on the run would tell stories of going days without seeing him, only to find the ashes of a campfire still warm, just 100 yards from where they had slept. They would hear a branch snap in the dead of night and know, with a certainty that chilled their blood, that it wasn't a deer. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just running from the law, they were running from a ghost who knew every secret trail and every hidden cave. The moment of capture was rarely a chaotic firefight. More often, it was a scene of terrifying quiet. After days of being worn down by exhaustion and paranoia, the cornered man would look up to see Bud Hatfield standing at the edge of his camp, a Colt revolver held loosely at his side. He wouldn't shout or make demands. He would just stand there, his eyes flat and cold, his presence promising a swift and final violence if the wrong choice was made. Faced with that unflinching, predatory stare, most men simply gave up. Hardened killers who had sworn they'd never be taken alive would slowly raise their hands, their will to fight completely broken. They understood in that silent moment that they were not facing a man, but a reckoning. The hunt would end not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs, a sound that signaled the total and absolute surrender of the old world to the new law of the mountains. The Logan County Courthouse once a sleepy building of legal debate, transformed under Bud Hatfield's reign. It became a theater of fear. When the sheriff brought a prisoner to trial, the room was packed not with curious onlookers, but with a silent, tense audience of clan members and enemies, all watching each other. Armed deputies, loyal only to Bud, stood at every exit, their presence a constant, unspoken threat. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with legal arguments. It was the ancient tension of the mountains, of blood feuds and violent retribution, now brought indoors and wrapped in the thin veneer of official procedure. The trials themselves became a grim formality. The defendants Bud brought in didn't swagger or boast. They stood before the judge with the hollow-eyed look of a cornered animal that has already accepted its fate. Their real trial hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had occurred days earlier in a dark hollow at the end of a relentless manhunt when they looked up and saw Bud Hatfield emerge from the trees. By the time they reached the courthouse, their spirit was already broken. Their reaction was not one of defiance, but of quiet, defeated submission. Even the sharpest lawyers learned a new set of rules. You did not aggressively cross-examine Sheriff Hatfield. You did not challenge his account of the arrest. To do so was to imply he was a liar, and you could feel the temperature in the room drop when it happened. Witnesses for the prosecution spoke with a newfound clarity, while those for the defense often found their memories grew foggy under the weight of the sheriff's quiet, unblinking stare from the front row. It wasn't jury tampering in the traditional sense, it was an atmosphere of pure, suffocating intimidation. The verdicts, when they came, were swift and almost always the same: guilty. The conviction rate in Logan County skyrocketed. The payroll robberies stopped. The open brawling ceased. On paper, it was a staggering success. The law of men, with its procedures and its juries, was finally working. But a chilling question hung over every conviction, whispered on the courthouse steps after the prisoner had been dragged away in chains. Was this truly justice? Or had Bud Hatfield simply brought the old ways of the mountains inside the courthouse walls? He had not replaced the clan's code with the state's law. He had merged them into something new and terrifying. He used the tools of the state, the badge, the courts, the prisons, to enforce his own absolute, iron-willed version of mountain justice. The mastermind of it all was Bud himself, and he was never on trial. He was the judge, jury, and executioner long before any gavel fell. The people of Logan County had order, but many wondered if they had sacrificed justice to get it. After the trials were over and the jail cells were full, the Hatfield clan did not declare open war on their cousin. They did something far colder, far more final. They simply erased him. He became a ghost in his own family tree, a name spoken only in whispers of contempt. To the world, he was the powerful Sheriff Hatfield, but to the people who shared his blood, he was a dead man walking. The price for his iron-fisted order was a profound and permanent exile. He had brought the law to the mountains, but in the process, he had lost his home. Bud's life became a strange paradox. He was the most powerful man in the county, yet he was also the most alone. He walked the streets of Logan, a solitary king, his throne built on fear, and his kingdom populated by subjects who hated him. The justice he escaped in the courthouse found him in the shadows. Attempts on his life became a regular occurrence. A rifle shot that echoed from a distant ridge, narrowly missing his head. A stick of dynamite found under a bridge he was about to cross. He survived them all, his uncanny instincts and sheer, stubborn meanness keeping death at bay. But it was a life lived on a razor's edge, a constant grinding war of attrition. The mountains themselves seemed to hold a grudge, and every rustling leaf, every snapping twig was a potential threat. He was not a lawman. He was a warden in a prison of his own making. Whether he was truly haunted by the ghost of Bad Lias, as the campfire tales claimed, is a question that lies buried with him. But those who knew him in his later years described a man hollowed out from the inside. The chilling calm he displayed at the ferry landing became his permanent state. The silence around him wasn't just a result of the fear he inspired, it was a reflection of the silence within his own soul. He had made a deal to bring order, but the cost was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of seeing his cousin's face in the eyes of every man he arrested, and of knowing that the blood he spilled could never be washed away. This was his true sentence, not a curse from a ghost, but the relentless atonement of a man living with the consequences of an unforgivable choice. As the years passed, and Bud's era of iron rule eventually faded, the community did what communities do after a great trauma. It chose to forget. It was easier to talk about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a distant, almost romantic conflict, than to speak of the time when a Hatfield hunted Hatfields. The story was too raw, too close, a mirror that showed a reflection of themselves they did not want to see. The tale of Sheriff Bud Hatfield, the kinslayer who brought order, was buried under new roads, new coal mines, and a thick, heavy blanket of willful silence. Today, the name Hatfield is known across the world, often romanticized as a symbol of rugged Appalachian defiance. Tourists flock to see the statue of Devil Anse, the great patriarch, standing proudly in a family cemetery. But there is no statue for Sheriff Bud Hatfield. For his descendants, the inheritance is a far more complicated thing. They carry a name associated not with a legendary feud, but with a kinslaying. It's a legacy of uncomfortable silence, a chapter of the family history that is rarely spoken of, a ghost that still lingers at the edge of family gatherings. The physical traces of his reign are faint, like old scars on the land. The courthouse in Logan may have been replaced by a newer building, but the spot where it stood remains a symbol of his absolute power, a place where the law of men was bent to the will of one man. But the true monument to his legacy is unmarked, and it lies on a quiet stretch of the Tug Fork River. There is no plaque, no cross to mark the spot where Bad Lias fell. It is just an ordinary ferry landing, a place where the slow brown water slips past the banks, holding its secrets close. It is a place of profound and terrible memory, hiding in plain sight. The official records of his arrests and the newspaper articles praising his efficiency still exist, gathering dust in archives. But the true story of Sheriff Hatfield is no longer found in books. It has seeped back into the soil from which it came, becoming a piece of folklore. It lives on in the quiet conversations of old men on their porches, a cautionary tale told to grandsons about the danger of putting a badge before blood and the terrible price of absolute order. The coal mines have scarred the hills, new roads have been paved over the old horse trails, and the world has moved on. The people have forgotten, or perhaps have chosen to forget the specifics of that dark time. But the mountains have not. They were the silent witnesses to it all, to the oath, the hunt, and the final fatal shot on the riverbank. The mountains remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the air like gun smoke on that fateful day. How does a Hatfield bring himself to kill a Hatfield for a tin star? The simple answer is that he didn't. Bud Hatfield wasn't fighting for the law of the state. He was fighting for his own brutal vision of survival. He saw a world of chaos and blood that was being devoured by an even greater predator, the coal companies and their armies of hired guns. He believed the old ways of the clan were a sentimental weakness, a path to extinction. So he made a terrible choice. He became a monster to save the mountains from other monsters, sacrificing his own family and his own soul in the process. This is a story not just of one complicated man, but of the brutal, heartbreaking bargain Appalachia was forced to make. It's a story about what happens when the forces of the modern world come for a land steeped in tradition, blood, and honor. Bud Hatfield is the personification of that collision. He was the iron will that brought order, but it was the order of the gallows, the peace of the graveyard. His life is a testament to the fact that sometimes the man who claims to be bringing civilization is more savage than the wilderness he is trying to tame. So the next time you hear the name Hatfield and you think of the famous feud, I want you to remember this story. Remember the man who was both a lawman and a kinslayer, a hero and a traitor, a savior and a beast. He was a man forged in the crucible of the mountains, who then used that fire to burn away the very world that created him, leaving behind nothing but the cold ashes of order. And now, my friends, another one of these forgotten stories has been told. They say that on the night Talton Hall died, the mountains themselves held their breath. This wasn't a death in a blaze of glory, not a gunfight between two men in a dusty street. This was something colder. This was a mob, silent and determined, dragging a shackled man from a train car. This was the end of the line for the man they called the Pikeville Killer, the Mountain Demon, his fate sealed not by a judge's gavel, but by a rope thrown over the branch of a maple tree. How does a man become so feared that his death becomes a legend? Was he a simple monster, a killer for hire who finally ran out of road? Or was he something more complex, a perfect, brutal product of a lawless time? To understand what happened on that September night in 1892, we have to go back. We have to trace the bloody path that led Talton Hall from the anonymous hollows of Kentucky to his final, haunting dance at the end of a rope. To understand the man, you have to understand the mountains that made him. Talton Hall was born around 1846 into a world that was already old, a world of deep hollows and interlocking ridges that separated families from the law, from the government, and from each other. In these parts of eastern Kentucky, a man's world was as big as he could walk in a day, and his only true allegiance was to his kin. Justice wasn't something you found in a courthouse, it was something you took with a rifle in your hands. This was the soil where a man like Hall would take root. The great bloody catalyst of his life was the Civil War. For the rest of America, it was a war of armies and grand campaigns. But in the Cumberland Mountains, it was a poison that seeped into every creek and holler. It was a war of bushwhackers and home guards, where your neighbor might be a secret enemy and a knock on the door at night could mean death. Young Talton came of age in this furnace. He would have seen men hanged for their loyalties, families burned out of their homes, and vendettas born that would fester for generations. This is where he learned his first, and perhaps only, lesson. The world is a brutal place, and the only certainty is the man who is quicker on the draw. When the war ended on paper, it didn't end in the mountains. The soldiers came home, but they brought the war with them. They were men skilled in the art of ambush, tracking and killing, skills that didn't have much use in a peaceful world. But their world wasn't peaceful. Old grudges from the war now mixed with new disputes over land, timber, and politics. This chaotic, violent landscape became a job market for men who had a talent for death. The code of the mountains was built on honor. You defended your family, you avenged insults, and you never ever backed down from a fight. It was a harsh code, but it had its own logic. For Talton Hall, this code seems to have been stripped of its heart, leaving only the cold mechanics of violence. He saw that the loyalty men had to their families could be manipulated. He saw that honor could be used as an excuse for murder. And he realized that his own detachment, his lack of fierce loyalty to any one clan, was a valuable commodity. Imagine him as a young man, perhaps returning from the fringes of the war. He sees the Hatfield clan rising in power, the McCoy clan nursing their wounds, and a dozen smaller families sharpening their knives over some perceived slight. He watches as men kill each other for the sake of a family name, for a pig, for a dirty look. And in that moment, he doesn't see tragedy or honor. He sees an opportunity. He sees a world where his steady hand and empty conscience could earn him a living. This was the forge that created Talton Hall. The isolation of the mountains taught him self-reliance. The viciousness of the Civil War taught him that life was cheap. and the simmering feuds of the aftermath taught him that there was always someone willing to pay to make someone else's life a little cheaper. He wasn't born a monster. He was hammered into one by the unrelenting violence of his time. Before the name Talton Hall was a curse whispered in the dark, there was simply the man. In the years before his infamy became legend, he was, in his own way, a picture of mountain competence. He was a master of the wilderness, a man who could read the forest like a book and track a deer for days without making a sound. He was a crack shot, his skill with a rifle a thing of local renown. In a land where these abilities meant the difference between a full belly and starvation, or life and death in a confrontation, Talton Hall was exceptionally gifted. He embodied the rugged self-sufficiency that his world demanded. In the periods between the bloody work that would later define him, his life was likely one of stark simplicity. He would have had a cabin tucked away in a hollow so deep and remote that the law was just a rumor. There, he was just another man living off the land, hunting, perhaps tending a small patch of corn for his own use. This was his sanctuary, the place where the ghost could rest. This quiet, solitary existence was the world he sought to protect. It was a world built not on love or community, but on anonymity and isolation, a peace purchased with the proceeds of violence. His relationships, too, were likely forged in the currency of the mountains, fear and pragmatism. He had kin, as all men did, and they would have afforded him the loyalty that blood demanded. But it would have been a loyalty tinged with terror. They may have benefited from his protection, safe in the knowledge that no one would dare cross the family of Talton Hall. But they would have lived under the shadow of his cold nature, always aware of what he was capable of. He wasn't a man who inspired love. He inspired a dreadful, unshakable respect. In his prime, before the New Year's massacre and the murder of Officer Belcher, his reputation was less that of a demon and more that of a tool. A dangerous tool, but a useful one. If a timber company needed a troublesome squatter scared off a piece of land, they might seek out Talt Hall. If a moonshiner needed his still guarded from rivals or federal agents, Hall was the man for the job. He was seen as a regulator, a human weapon to be aimed at a problem. He was the final, violent answer to a dispute that couldn't be settled any other way. In the brutal logic of the mountains, he provided a service. This was the life he built, a quiet existence in the hollows, punctuated by brief, violent forays into the world of men. His stake in the world wasn't a family's love or a community's admiration. It was his freedom. The freedom to move through the mountains unseen, to be a name without a face, and to be the master of his own dark destiny. It was this self-contained, predatory world that was about to be threatened, and its destruction would unleash the full measure of his brutality. Every great tragedy is born from a single, deep-seated flaw. For Talton Hall, it wasn't greed or a quick temper. His flaw was a cold, patient arrogance, a venom that had been brewing for years. He had operated as a shadow for so long, a bringer of death who melted back into the mists, that he had begun to believe he was untouchable. He saw himself as an instrument of a higher, more primal law, and he believed the world of common men, with their sheriffs and their courts, simply did not apply to him. This wasn't just simple pride, it was a core part of his professional identity. It was a shield. The stories they told about him in hushed tones around the fireplace weren't just tales, they were his armor. It was said that Hall could walk into a crowded Pikeville saloon, and the simple act of him ordering a whiskey would be enough to end a loud argument at the other end of the room. He didn't have to raise his voice or draw his gun. He would just fix his piercing eyes on the source of the trouble, and the problem would evaporate. He had come to rely on this aura of fear, to see it as an absolute power. This belief in his own myth was both his greatest strength and his most profound weakness. It gave him the nerve to take on impossible jobs, to face down armed men without flinching. It was the source of the chilling calm he possessed in moments of extreme violence. He wasn't afraid because he genuinely believed he was death itself, and what does death have to fear? But that armor had a crack. Over time, he began to forget the difference between being feared in the secret world of the feuds and being feared in the open world of growing towns. He started to believe his reputation alone would bend reality to his will, no matter where he was or who he was facing. He thought the name Talton Hall was a magic word that made all obstacles disappear. This supreme arrogance, this absolute faith in his own terrifying legend, was making him careless. He began to take risks, to operate more openly, to let the world see the monster it had only whispered about. He was walking a razor's edge, convinced he would never fall, unaware that the world was changing around him. The very flaw that had kept him alive in the lawless wilderness was about to become the engine of his own destruction in a place where a badge and a uniform had started to mean something. For a man who lived in the shadows, Talton Hall had grown dangerously comfortable with the light. In 1891, he crossed the state line into the burgeoning town of Norton, Virginia. He wasn't there on business, not for a contract. He was there for himself, and he was full of whiskey. The quiet, calculating professional had been swallowed by the arrogant legend. He was loud, belligerent, and causing a disturbance, a man who believed his very name was a shield that made him immune to consequence. He was no longer a specter of death. He was a drunken bully, daring the world to challenge him. And the world sent a man named Charles H. Belcher. He wasn't a rival feudist or a hired gun. He was a town policeman, a symbol of everything the mountains were not. He represented order, society, and a law written in books, not in blood. When he saw the disturbance Hall was causing, he did his duty. He walked toward the Pikeville killer, his simple blue uniform a stark contrast to Hall's reputation, which was as dark and formless as a mountain shadow. For Officer Belcher, this was just another drunk to be quieted. He had no idea he was walking toward a man who considered himself a god. The affront, in Hall's mind, was not an insult or a threat. It was the simple act of being confronted. The moment Belcher spoke to him, the moment he attempted to impose the town's law on the mountain's killer, was an intolerable challenge to Hall's entire existence. Eyewitnesses would later describe the look in Hall's eyes, not anger, but a cold, dismissive contempt. Here was a man with a tin badge who thought he could lay hands on Talton Hall. The arrogance that had been simmering for years now boiled over. In Hall's mind, this wasn't a man. It was an obstacle, a thing to be removed. His reaction was not the wild swing of a drunk. It was the chillingly efficient motion of a professional. As Officer Belcher moved to make the arrest, Hall drew his pistol. There was no hesitation, no final warning. The movement was as natural and practiced as breathing. He fired, and Charles Belcher fell to the dusty street. It was not an act of passion or self-defense. It was a correction. It was Talton Hall reminding the world of the natural order of things, where he was the predator and men like Belcher were the prey. But this time was different. In that single deafening moment, Hall's fatal flaw had sealed his fate. He hadn't just killed another man in a long line of men. He had murdered a uniformed officer of the law in public, in the middle of a town that was trying to call itself civilized. He thought he was just swatting away an annoyance, but he had just declared war on the states of Virginia and Kentucky. The gunshot that killed Charles Belcher was an echo that would shake the mountains, and it would hunt Talton Hall to the very end of his days. The murder of a lawman in Norton was a line crossed, a bell that could not be unrung. Talton Hall, a master of the Appalachian wilderness, did what he always did. He vanished. He slipped back across the border into the familiar tangled hollows of Kentucky, believing he could wait out the storm as he had done a dozen times before. This was his first and most arrogant mistake. He thought he had merely killed a man. He failed to understand that he had murdered a symbol, and civilization itself was now coming for him. The response was unlike anything the mountains had ever seen. This wasn't a half-hearted posse led by a local sheriff who was likely related to the man he was hunting. The states of Virginia and Kentucky pooled their resources. Bounties were posted, large enough to make a poor farmer forget all about mountain loyalty. And then came the name that struck a different kind of fear into the hearts of outlaws: the Pinkertons. They were relentless, methodical men who couldn't be bribed, intimidated, or swayed by family ties. They were a modern machine of justice, and they were hunting a relic from a bygone era. Warnings came, not from his enemies, but from what few allies he had left. Old associates, men who understood the shifting tides of power, would have told him in no uncertain terms, "Talt, this is different," they'd say. "You killed a badge in the street. They ain't gonna stop. You need to go west, disappear for good." They offered him the only path that might lead to survival, true, absolute anonymity, far from the mountains that knew his name. But Talton Hall's arrogance was a wall that no reason could penetrate. He scoffed at the warnings. He had outsmarted the law his entire life. He saw the Pinkertons as nothing more than city boys who would get lost in the first creek bed. In his mind, this massive manhunt was almost a testament to his own legend. It was a grand, fitting challenge for the Pikeville killer. He believed he was smarter, tougher, and more cunning than any man they could send after him. He saw every posted bounty with his name on it, not as a threat, but as an acknowledgement of his status. With each passing week, however, his world shrank. The net tightened. A cabin door that would have once swung open for him now remained bolted shut. A meal that would have been freely given was now denied. The fear of the law had finally begun to outweigh the fear of Talton Hall. He was becoming a ghost in his own homeland, a toxic presence that even his own kin could no longer afford to shelter. Each closed door was another offer of help rejected, another chance to escape squandered because his pride would not let him see the truth. He was being squeezed out of the only environment where he knew how to survive. The decision to finally flee, to make a run for a place like Memphis, Tennessee, was not a strategic retreat. It was an act of desperation. He was leaving the tangled wilderness that was his shield and armor and heading for the open, anonymous streets of a city. He was a mountain predator who had been driven from his forest, forced to walk onto the open plains where the hunters could see him for miles. His path of no compromise had led him right into a trap of his own making. Memphis was a cage of brick and smoke, a foreign land to a man born of mist and shadow. Talton Hall was cornered. He could feel it in the way people looked at him on the street, in the tightening knot in his own gut. The relentless machinery of the law, guided by the cold intelligence of the Pinkertons, had found him. He was no longer the apex predator of the Kentucky hollows. He was a wolf tracked to a city alley, with the hounds closing in. He was in a cheap boarding house, listening to the city breathe, knowing that each breath might be his last moment of freedom. And then he heard it. The heavy, deliberate footsteps on the boarding house stairs. This was it. This was the moment that had been coming for him since the day he pulled the trigger on Officer Belcher. In that quiet, terrifying space between one footstep and the next, he stood at his final crossroads. He had one last choice to make. He could wait, hands empty, and surrender. He could give himself up to the justice he had so long despised, face a trial, a judge, a jury. It would mean a cage, a public shaming, but it would also mean life. It was the off-ramp, the final chance to let this story end, not with a bang, but with the quiet closing of a cell door. For a split second, a different path might have appeared in his mind's eye. A long, drawn-out trial, a life spent in a stone penitentiary. Could Talton Hall, the mountain demon, truly allow himself to be led in chains, to be put on display like a captured animal? Could the man, whose reputation was a weapon in itself, allow that reputation to be stripped away, leaving only a common, pathetic killer? The very idea was a kind of death more profound than any bullet. It was an assault on the only thing he had ever truly built, his own terrifying myth. The answer, when it came, was as swift and final as one of his own gunshots. No. The thought was more repulsive than a hangman's noose. His arrogance, the fatal flaw that had brought him to this very room, made its final stand. He would not be broken. He would not be humiliated. The law could have his body, but it would not have his submission. He made a conscious, chilling choice. He rejected the chance for a quiet end and fully embraced the violent destiny he had been carving for himself his entire life. He didn't make a run for the window or try to barricade the door. That was the act of a desperate man hoping to live. Instead, he calmly walked to his bag, pulled out his revolver, and checked the loads. Each click of the cylinder was a word in his final sentence. In that moment, he sealed his own fate, not with resignation, but with defiance. He chose to be the Pikeville killer right to the very end. The lawmen breaking down his door wouldn't be capturing a fugitive. They would be walking into the last act of a legend, an act that Tulton Hall himself had decided to write in blood. The splintering of the door was the only warning he needed. It wasn't the sound of a lock being picked or a hinge being forced. It was the raw, violent crack of wood giving way to brute force. For Tulton Hall, the world, which had been a tightening cage of streets and unfamiliar faces, suddenly shrank to the size of that small boarding house room. He was a creature of the deep woods, and in that moment, the lawmen crashing through the door were no different from a pack of hounds cornering a wolf in a box canyon. He wasn't panicked. He was eerily calm, the way a man is when he finally meets a fate he has been expecting his whole life. All the running, all the hiding, it had all led to this cramped, smoke-stained room. The revolver felt cool and familiar in his hand, a solid piece of certainty in a world that was coming apart. The figures in the doorway were just shapes, dark silhouettes against the light of the hallway, and in his mind, they ceased to be men. They were simply the final problem he had to solve. His hand moved with a fluid economy that was born of 1,000 deadly calculations. The room erupted in a deafening concussion of sound and fire. The muzzle flash was a bolt of lightning in the dimness, momentarily illuminating the determined faces in the doorway. It was the only language he knew how to speak to a world that sought to contain him, a single, explosive syllable of pure defiance. The smell of burnt gunpowder filled his nostrils, a scent more familiar to him than any perfume. But this was not a mountain holler where a single shot could settle an argument for good. Thunder answered thunder from the doorway. More flashes of light strobed across the room, turning the air into a chaotic storm of noise and swirling, acrid smoke. The world narrowed to the kick of the revolver in his hand, the ringing in his ears that drowned out all other sounds, and the shadowy dance of figures in the smoke. For a few heartbeats, Tulton Hall was in his element, a whirlwind of violence at the heart of the storm. Then, a sensation he hadn't felt in years, a sharp, searing impact in his arm, a force that felt like a blacksmith's hammer. His fingers went numb. His trusted revolver, the instrument of his will, suddenly felt like a useless lump of lead. The weapon clattered to the wooden floor, the sound small and insignificant after the deafening roar of the gunfight. The storm inside the room had passed as quickly as it had begun. An almost supernatural silence descended, broken only by the harsh sound of men breathing and the slow, acrid clearing of the gun smoke. The dark silhouettes in the doorway resolved into tired, grim-faced lawmen, their own pistols still smoking. They moved in, not with anger, but with a weary professionalism. The fight was over. The great Tulton Hall, the Pikeville killer, was standing in a ruined room, his arm useless, his gun on the floor. The final act was not a shout, but a cold, metallic whisper. The chilling slide and click of handcuffs locking around his wrists. That sound, more than any bullet, was the one that ended his life. In that moment, the legend died, and all that was left was a captured man facing the cold, methodical justice he had so long outrun. The roaring storm of his life had ended in the quiet snap of a lock. There was no triumph in the eyes of the lawmen who took him, only a grim, professional exhaustion. For Talton Hall, the moments after his capture were a blur of pain from his wounded arm and the heavier, colder pain of the shackles on his wrists. The swagger of the untouchable killer was finally gone, replaced by the quiet, heavy stillness of a caged animal. He wasn't filled with regret or fear, but with a deep, sullen emptiness. The world had finally proven to be bigger and stronger than his own myth, and the realization settled on him like a shroud. His journey back to the mountains was not a victory parade for the law. It was a covert operation, thick with tension. They knew the name Talton Hall still held power, that his allies might try to free him, or worse, that the families of his victims might try to kill him before he ever saw a courtroom. So they put him on a train, but its route was a lie, a winding, circuitous path designed to throw off any potential ambushes. He was heavily guarded, a man so dangerous that even in chains, he was treated like a ticking bomb. For Hall, the journey was a special kind of hell. He sat in the rattling train car, watching the familiar landscape of his homeland slide by through the grimy window. He saw the misty blue ridges, the deep, dark hollows, the very terrain that had once been his fortress and his kingdom. Now, it was just scenery on his final ride. Each mile that clicked by on the tracks was a mile closer to his end. He was a king being paraded through his conquered territory, a ghost forced to revisit his old haunting grounds one last time, not as a predator, but as prey. He was silent the whole way, a brooding, dark presence that unnerved even his seasoned guards. The fight had gone out of him, but the malice had not. He was no longer an active player in his own story. He was cargo. His fate was now in the hands of other men, and his only remaining role was to arrive at his destination. The end of the road for Talton Hall wasn't going to be a courtroom or a jail cell. It was this train, this slow, rattling journey back into the heart of the mountains that were waiting to claim him, one way or another. The news of Talton Hall's capture didn't travel by wire or by rail. It moved like smoke on the wind, from one isolated cabin to the next, carried by riders on horseback and whispered across fence lines. And with that news, the fragile, fearful peace of the mountains was shattered. The fall of one man sent a shockwave that would ripple through every holler, leaving a trail of wreckage that had little to do with Hall himself. His personal story was ending, but the tragedy he had authored was just entering its most brutal chapter. For his own kin, the name Hall, once a shield of fear, now became a target. The protection his terrifying reputation had afforded them vanished overnight. Now, they were just the family of a captured killer, vulnerable and exposed. Every shadow on the road, every late-night bark of a dog would send a spike of fear through them. They were living in the crosshairs of every man who had ever held a grudge against Talton, and that was a very long list. The sins of the father were about to be visited upon them, and their lives would become a paranoid existence of bolted doors and watchful eyes. For the families of his victims, the news was not a relief. It was a call to arms. For the widow of Charles Belcher, it was the reawakening of a grief that was still raw. For the remaining McCoys, who had seen their brothers tied to pawpaw trees and their sister shot down in the snow, this was not a matter for a distant court. It was a personal debt of blood that had come due. Hall's capture didn't bring closure. It tore the scabs off wounds that had never healed, and the pain demanded a release. Their desire was not for legal proceedings, it was for a reckoning. The entire community felt the tremor. For years, the violence had been, if not controlled, then at least predictable. It followed the dark logic of the feuds. But Hall's capture created a power vacuum, a chaotic moment where old hatreds could flare without a central figure to fear. He had acted as a cancer on the region, and his removal didn't cure the disease. It simply sent the body into a violent, final spasm. The quiet resentment of his reign of terror now had a voice, and it was a chorus calling for vengeance. The true wreckage Talton Hall left behind was not the bodies he had buried, but the hatred he had cultivated. He had spent his life profiting from the region's culture of violence, and now, even in chains, he was about to give it one last, terrible gift. His capture hadn't brought peace. It had simply brought the promise of a different, more terrible kind of violence, a communal violence, where an entire region, haunted by his ghost, would gather to deliver a final bloody verdict of its own. The law had done its part. It had hunted a killer across state lines, engaged him in a gunfight, and brought him back in chains. The next step in the machinery of civilization was a trial, a slow, methodical process of evidence, testimony, and deliberation. The Commonwealth of Kentucky intended to give Talton Hall a proper legal defense, a jury of his peers, and a verdict rendered under the solemn roof of a courthouse. It was a testament to the new order that was trying to tame the mountains, an insistence that the rule of law was absolute and applied to all men, even the devil of the tug fork. But in the mountains, another court was already in session. This court didn't meet in a building. It gathered in secret, in barns and on ridges, under the cold light of the moon. Its jurors were men with names like McCoy and Belcher. Its evidence was not written on paper, but scarred into their memories. The image of a burning cabin, of brothers tied to trees, of a good man bleeding out in a dusty street. The code they operated under was ancient, simple, and merciless. It was the mountain code of an eye for an eye, a blood debt that could only be paid in one currency. The clash between these two systems of justice was inevitable. As the train carrying Talton Hall chugged closer to Pikeville, the official legal process became more and more irrelevant. The law saw a prisoner who needed to be tried. The community saw a rabid dog that needed to be put down. The lawmen guarding Hall were operating under their code of duty and due process. The mob gathering to meet the train was operating under a code of honor and vengeance that was etched into the very stones of the mountains. The community's verdict had been reached long before Hall was ever captured. He was guilty, not just of killing Officer Belcher, but of everything. He was the living embodiment of the fear and violence that had plagued their lives for a generation. A trial, in their eyes, was a farce. It was a place where legal tricks and silver-tongued lawyers might let a monster walk free. They had seen it happen before. They had no faith in a system that seemed so far removed from the raw, immediate reality of their lives. They believed in a more direct, more certain form of justice. The train carrying Talton Hall was the ultimate symbol of this clash. Inside the car was the prisoner of the state, a component in a legal machine. But outside, gathering in the darkness, was the judgment of the mountains. The law's plan was to deliver him to a jail. The mountain's plan was to deliver him to a tree. In the end, it was a question of whose jurisdiction was more powerful in that place, on that night. Was it the new, fragile authority of the state, or the old, unyielding power of the clan? The answer was coming as surely as the train was coming down the tracks. While Talton Hall was taking his last ragged breaths in a Virginia town square, another man, a far more powerful one, was watching the world change from his porch in West Virginia. What became of Anderson Devil Anse Hatfield, the patriarch who had employed Hall's gun and allegedly directed the New Year's night massacre? Did he face a mob's justice? Did he ever see the inside of a courtroom for the crimes of the feud? The answer adds a bitter, complex layer to this story of mountain justice. The brutal attack on the McCoy cabin was a turning point. It was too savage, even for the feuding mountains, and it brought the full weight of the law down on the Hatfield clan. Several of Devil Anse's sons and supporters were hunted down, tried, and sent to prison. One, Ellison Cottontop Mounts, was hanged for his role in the massacre. The political power that Devil Anse had wielded for decades began to crumble. The war was over, and in a way, he had lost. But Devil Anse himself, the great leader of the clan, was never made to pay by the law. He was indicted, but he was never arrested. never forced to stand trial for the murders of the McCoy children. He lived out the rest of his days as a timberman and a farmer, a living legend who had outlasted his own violent era. In a final strange twist, the man they called Devil Anse was baptized in his old age, seeking peace with his God after a life of war with his neighbors. He died of pneumonia in 1921 and was buried on a mountainside overlooking the land he had fought so fiercely to control. This is the messy, unsatisfying truth of it all. Talton Hall, the hired gun, the disposable instrument of violence, was lynched by a mob for a crime committed in the open. His death was brutal, public, and absolute. But the powerful man who had allegedly paid for his services, who had directed the feud from the top, died a free man in his own bed. The mob got its vengeance, but it got it from the hired help, not the man who wrote the checks. The story of Talton Hall's end is not just about justice being served, it's about who it's served to and who gets to walk away. After the mob dispersed and Talton Hall's body was cut down, a strange and heavy quiet fell over Wise, Virginia, and the surrounding mountains. The great bloody chapter was over, but the book was not yet closed. The years that followed were not years of celebration or relief. They were years of silence. The community had performed a brutal act of surgery on itself, cutting out a cancer. But the wound was deep, jagged, and slow to heal. For the descendants of Talton Hall, the name became a curse and a burden. They scattered, some moving deeper into the anonymous folds of the mountains, others leaving the region entirely, hoping to outrun the ghost of their infamous kinsman. They became quiet farmers, miners, and laborers, their primary goal to be unremarkable, to be forgotten. To admit you were kin to Talton Hall was to invite suspicion and open old wounds. They buried the name under a blanket of deliberate obscurity, hoping that with enough time, the blood on it would fade. The community, too, sought healing through a kind of collective amnesia. The men who had been part of the lynch mob went back to their fields and their families. They had to live and trade with their neighbors, some of whom might have been Hall's distant kin. To speak of that night, to name the names of the men who held the rope, would have been to invite a new generation of bloodshed. And so, they simply stopped talking about it. The lynching of Talton Hall became a story told only to outsiders or to children as a cautionary tale. Within the community itself, it was a scar that everyone could see, but no one dared to touch. But the power dynamics of the region had been irrevocably altered. Hall's death was a brutal exclamation point at the end of an era. It was a clear and bloody message that the days of the untouchable gunfighter, the man who could be hired to settle a family squabble with a rifle, were over. The power of the old clan patriarchs like Devil Anse was waning, replaced by the growing influence of coal company bosses and county sheriffs. The law, which had failed to bring Hall to a trial, had still won in the end. The community's own violent act of justice had, ironically, reinforced the idea that the old way of the feud was a path to ruin for everyone involved. The era of private wars was dying, and the era of state-sponsored law, however flawed, was being born. The man named Talton Hall was gone, but the ghost of his name lingered. For decades, the most powerful physical remnant of his story was not a grave, but a tree. The big maple in the courthouse square in Wise, Virginia, became a dark landmark. People would point it out to their children, their voices dropping to a whisper. "That's the tree," they'd say. "That's where they hung the Pikeville killer." Its branches, which had once offered shade, now seemed to cast a permanent, chilling shadow. It was a living monument to a night of mob justice, its roots rumored to have drunk deep from the blood-soaked ground. Eventually, as the town grew and tried to bury its violent past, the tree was cut down, its wood hauled away, as if removing the object could erase the memory. His other physical traces were quietly erased. There is no grand tombstone bearing his name. He was likely buried in an unmarked potter's field, a final anonymous end for a man whose name once commanded such terror. The cabins he lived in have long since rotted back into the damp earth of the hollows, leaving no trace. It's a strange and fitting irony. The man who worked so hard to be a faceless shadow in life was rendered completely faceless in death. All of his physical reality was scrubbed from the world. But you can't kill a good story, and the tale of Talton Hall was too dark and powerful to die. It transformed. It left the realm of history and entered the world of folklore. For generations, people in Wise claimed that on still, moonlit nights, if you looked at the spot where the old maple stood, you could still see him. A spectral figure, dangling silently in the air, a permanent, ghostly reminder of the night the law of the mountains was served. The man became a boogeyman, a cautionary tale told to frighten unruly children into behaving. His life became a kind of unwritten murder ballad, the verses known by heart in every holler. He was no longer just a man, he was a character, a symbol of the entire bloody era of the feuds. His name became a shorthand for a certain kind of cold, professional violence. When old-timers spoke of the bad days, of the lawless times before the coal companies and the state police truly took hold, the name they would use to punctuate their point was always the same. It was a time of men like Talt Hall. So while the man himself is dust, and the tree that ended his life is gone, his spirit, the spirit of the mountain gunfighter, still haunts the collective memory of Appalachia. He is the ghost that walks the ridgelines of the past, a chilling echo of a time when justice didn't come from a book, but from the barrel of a gun and the end of a rope. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the very beginning, a question as quiet and heavy as the mountain fog. Was Talton Hall a hero or a villain? The answer is as clear and cold as a Kentucky creek in winter. He was no hero. He was a killer, a man who dealt in death for profit, whose hands were stained with the blood of an unknown number of men. There is no honor in that. But to simply call him a villain is to miss the deeper, more unsettling truth of his story. Talton Hall was not an aberration. He was a perfect, terrible product of his time and place. He was a monster, but a monster the mountains themselves had birthed. He was forged in the pointless brutality of the Civil War and sharpened on the whetstone of the feuds. He was the logical conclusion of a world where law was a suggestion and violence was a way of life. He was a symptom of a disease, not the disease itself. In the end, this is a story about a man whose greatest strength, his absolute belief in his own terrifying legend, became the flaw that destroyed him. He saw himself as a timeless force, a permanent part of the mountain landscape. But the world was changing around him. The law, clumsy and slow as it was coming. He was a relic of a savage past, unable and unwilling to adapt. The same cold arrogance that made him a feared gunfighter made him blind to the fact that his time was over. And that, my friends, is the ballad of Talton Hall. A killer who sold his gun to the highest bidder and whose life was finally paid for, not with silver dollars, but with a rope, in a town square that wanted to forget his name. "5 years before the shot heard round the world at Lexington, a different shot echoed through the Carolina backcountry. It was the sound of a cannon firing into a crowd of 2,000 farmers, men who had stood their ground against a disciplined army and roared back a phrase of pure Appalachian defiance: 'Fire and be damned.' They called themselves the Regulators, and their rebellion was drowned in blood. The history books often call it a riot. The locals know it was a war. What could drive God-fearing men to wage war on their own government, years before America was even a dream? Today, we will dig into the blood-soaked soil of Alamance and unearth the forgotten story of America's first armed uprising. To understand the fire, you must first understand the forest. Picture the Carolina backcountry in the 1760s. This wasn't the manicured world of coastal plantations with their grand houses and ships sailing for London. This was the edge of the map. It was a land of tangled forests, where ancient oaks stood shoulder to shoulder, and the ground was a web of creeks and rivers with names like the Haw and the Eno. The air here was different, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the only authority was the changing of the seasons and the word of God. The people who carved a life from this wilderness were as rugged as the terrain itself. They were mostly Scots-Irish and German immigrants, families who had fled the famines, wars, and religious persecution of the Old World. They came here not for riches, but for something far more precious, a piece of land to call their own and the right to be left alone. They were dissenters, Presbyterians and Lutherans, who held a deep and abiding suspicion of any government that smelled of the high and mighty Anglican Church they'd left behind. Their lives were a testament to pure grit. A man would build his cabin with his own 2 hands, felling the trees and notching the logs himself. He'd clear his fields one back-breaking stump at a time, his wife working right alongside him. They hunted for their meat, grew their own corn, and spun their own wool. Survival was a daily struggle against rocky soil, harsh winters, and the ever-present threat of raids. This constant hardship forged them into something tough, fiercely independent, and loyal only to their family, their clan, and their creator. In this world, money was a ghost. A farmer might go an entire year without seeing a single silver coin. The economy ran on barter and good faith. A bushel of corn might be traded for a new axe head. A day's labor might be paid with a salted ham. A man's worth wasn't measured by the gold in his pocket, but by the strength of his handshake, the straightness of his rifle shot, and the honor of his family name. But this isolated world of sweat and scripture was not its own kingdom. It was ruled from afar, from the balmy coastal cities, by a class of wealthy English gentlemen appointed by the royal governor. These men, in their powdered wigs and silk stockings, looked upon the backcountry settlers as little more than savages, crude, uneducated, and most importantly, a resource to be squeezed. A shadow was creeping west from the coast, a shadow of tax collectors and corrupt officials who spoke the language of coin and contracts. Little did the farmers know, this modern world was about to come knocking at their cabin doors, not with a friendly hand, but with a battering ram. This explosion of rage didn't come from nowhere. Its seeds were sown in the rocky soil of Scotland and the war-torn fields of Germany generations before. These families didn't come to the backcountry with land grants from a grateful king. They came as refugees. They bought their homesteads not with royal paper, but with the sharp steel of the axe and the cold lead of the long rifle. They carved their existence directly from a hostile wilderness, fighting the land, the weather, and the native tribes for every single acre. In their minds, this land wasn't given to them by a government. It was earned through a covenant of sweat, blood, and prayer. The old scars of history ran deep, carried across the Atlantic in their very bones. The Scots-Irish in particular had a long and bitter memory of English authority. For a century, they had been used as a buffer by the British Crown in the violent plantations of Ulster, only to be squeezed by the same government with crippling rents and religious persecution. When the king's new taxman, with his arrogant sneer and his stack of legal papers, showed up at their cabin door in Carolina, they didn't just see a colonial official. They saw the same old ghost of the English landlord they thought they had finally escaped. This created a division in the colony far deeper than any river or mountain range. It was a chasm of culture. On one side were the coastal elites, who saw themselves as Englishmen, loyal to the crown, the Anglican Church, and the intricate dance of colonial politics. On the other were the backcountry settlers, who felt no loyalty to a distant king or a governor who had never walked a furrow in his life. Their allegiance was to their own kind, to the Presbyterian meeting house, and to a simple, unwritten code of honor that valued a man's word over a lawyer's contract. In these mountains, a family name wasn't just a label, it was a legacy. A name like Fanning or Tryon carried the weight of unearned privilege and a history of looking down on the common man. but a backcountry name, a hunter, a husband, a Pew, carried the heavy burden of generations of struggle. It was a quiet promise to work hard, to stand by your neighbors, and to never, ever let an outsider push you off your land. To be a backcountry farmer meant you bent the knee to God alone. To be one of the governor's men meant you expected the world to bend the knee to you. A collision was not just likely, it was inevitable. The conflict didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with a whisper. A whisper at the grist mill, a bitter complaint muttered over a fence post, an angry prayer offered in the quiet of a cabin. The ground for this rebellion was salted with years of personal insults and public humiliations, all stemming from a group of men the farmers called the Courthouse Ring. This wasn't some shadowy conspiracy, it was a cancer of corruption that operated in plain sight. At its heart was Edmund Fanning, a man who became the living symbol of everything the backcountry had come to despise. He was a Yale-educated lawyer who wore fine clothes, lived in a mansion built with stolen money, and looked at the calloused hands of a farmer with open contempt. The old wounds were everywhere, festering in nearly every family. You see, the system was designed to break a man. A farmer might ride for 2 days to register the deed to his land, only to have a clerk, Fanning's cousin perhaps, charge him a filing fee that existed in no law book. Then the sheriff, another crony, would demand the annual poll tax be paid in hard coin, knowing full well the farmer dealt in tobacco and deer hides. When the farmer couldn't produce the silver, that same sheriff would seize his plough horse or his only milk cow, selling it at a rigged auction to another member of the ring for a fraction of its worth. This venom dripped into the community through the wellspring of gossip. After the Sunday sermon, men would gather under the shade of an oak, their voices low and hard. They'd share stories of the latest outrage. One man lost 10 acres over a debt of 5 shillings that had been bloated by illegal court costs. Another had been thrown in jail for daring to question the sheriff's math. These stories spread from homestead to homestead like a fever, each telling making the injustice feel more personal, more suffocating. The courthouse ring wasn't just stealing their property, it was stealing their dignity. Slowly, the atmosphere began to change. The respectful nod once offered to the county clerk was replaced by a cold, hateful stare. A trip into the county seat of Hillsborough felt less like going to town and more like walking into a nest of snakes. Every official document, every tax notice, every court summons was now seen not as the law of the land, but as another turn of the screw. The laughter in the local tavern grew harder, edged with a bitterness that wasn't just from the corn whiskey. A land dispute between neighbors was no longer just about a misplaced fence. It was interpreted as one side currying favor with the corrupt judges. A simple fistfight at a market fair became an act of class warfare. Every small misunderstanding, every past slight, was now magnified through the dark lens of this great grudge. The air itself grew thick with suspicion and resentment, turning old friends into potential enemies and transforming the quiet valleys of Carolina into a powder keg, just waiting for a single, careless spark. Before the storm breaks, the air always goes dead still. In the hills of Carolina, that stillness was filled with a rising dread. The old women, who carried the superstitions of Scotland and Germany in their bones, began to whisper. They spoke of the panther's scream sounding less like a cat and more like a woman mourning a child not yet lost. They saw bad signs in a flock of crows that flew silently over a homestead, and they claimed the daytime hoot of an owl from the deep woods was a certain omen of death. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the coming violence. Then came a different kind of omen, not from the woods, but a man on horseback. His name was Herman Husband, and he was a Quaker, a man of peace. But he wasn't preaching peace now. He was a pamphleteer, a man who wielded a printing press like a weapon. His fiery, biblically charged words began to circulate through the backcountry, passed from one calloused hand to the next, read by flickering candlelight in hushed cabins. He gave their anger a voice, framing their struggle not as a squabble over taxes, but as a holy war against the forces of greed and tyranny. His pamphlets were prophecies, laying out two clear paths. One led to liberty, the other to a life of perpetual slavery to the corrupt coastal elites. This sense of impending doom settled on the men like a shroud. You can just imagine a farmer sitting on his porch at dusk, cleaning his long rifle, the familiar weight of it in his hands. The evening is quiet. The crickets are chirping their usual song, but he feels a coldness creep into his gut that has nothing to do with the evening air. He looks at his wife and children through the cabin window, bathed in the warm glow of the hearth, and then he looks out at the dark, looming tree line. For the first time, he doesn't see a source of firewood and game. He sees a place to hide, a place to fight, a place to die. It was a premonition, a gut-wrenching certainty that the time for petitions and prayers was over, and the time for powder and shot was drawing terrifyingly near. For years, the farmers had tried to fight the system with its own weapons. They wrote petitions, polite and humble, begging the colonial assembly for relief. Each one was ignored, dismissed with the contempt a lord might show a serf. They tried to sue the corrupt officials, only to find the courts were run by the very same snakes who were robbing them blind. Every legal door was slammed in their faces. The pressure had been building for years, and in September of 1770, in the town of Hillsborough, the dam finally broke. This was no spontaneous riot. It was a calculated act of defiance. 150 regulators, their faces grim and set, marched into town on court day. They weren't a disorganized rabble. They were a determined force, armed with heavy sticks, farm tools, and a righteous fury that had been simmering for a decade. Their target was the courthouse, the very symbol of their oppression. They stormed the building, a wave of muddy boots and homespun cloth overwhelming the shocked officials. Their first act was to find Edmund Fanning. They dragged the despised official from the judge's bench, his fine clothes tearing in their grip. They threw him into the dusty street and beat him, not to kill, but to humiliate. Each blow was a release of years of pent-up rage for every illegal fee, every stolen horse, every contemptuous sneer. When they were done with Fanning, they turned on his house, a mansion so luxurious the farmers called it a palace built on their tears. They didn't just vandalize it, they dismantled it, brick by brick, until nothing was left but a pile of expensive rubble. Back in the courthouse, they held a mockery of justice. They dragged the judge from his seat and put one of their own in his place, going through the court docket and striking down the cases against their fellow farmers. This was more than a protest. It was a revolution in miniature. They weren't just attacking a man, they were attacking the entire legal and political authority of the royal governor. When news of the Hillsborough riot reached the coast, it was seen as a declaration of war. Governor William Tryon, an arrogant and ambitious military man, could not let this stand. This was a direct challenge to his power and, by extension, the power of the king. The line had been crossed. There would be no more petitions. There would be no more negotiations. The only answer now would come from the barrel of a gun. The first drops of blood had been metaphorical, spilled in the beating of a corrupt official and the destruction of his home. The next would be real. On the morning of May 16, 1771, two armies faced each other across a quiet field bordering Alamont's Creek. On one side stood Governor Tryon's militia, over 1,000 men in disciplined lines, their bayonets glinting in the spring sunlight. Before them sat the dark, menacing mouths of several cannon. On the other side, scattered amongst the trees and rocks, were 2,000 regulators. They were not an army. They were a gathering of fathers and sons, armed with the old hunting rifles and farm tools they used to feed their families. When the governor's final demand for surrender was met with that thunderous cry, "Fire and be damned," the fate of them all was sealed. There was no warning shot. The first sound was a deafening physical blow that seemed to tear the very fabric of the sky. The cannon spoke, and the world dissolved into smoke and a hellish roar. For the farmers, who had only ever known the sharp crack of a squirrel rifle, it was the sound of the apocalypse. The ground shook beneath their feet, and the air, which moments before had carried the scent of honeysuckle, was instantly choked with the bitter, sulphurous stink of black powder. Through the eyes of a young boy hiding behind a wagon, the battle was not a series of heroic charges, but a terrifying blur of chaos. He saw the man who had been his neighbor, a man he'd known his whole life, suddenly stagger and fall as if tripped by an invisible hand. There was no dramatic cry, just a quiet, heavy collapse into the grass. He heard the pop, pop, pop of the regulator rifles, a desperate and scattered sound, answered by the terrifying, unified crash of hundreds of militia muskets firing as one. It was the sound of a handful of pebbles thrown against a stone wall. The air itself became a lethal thing, filled with a constant, high-pitched whine. Leaves and twigs were clipped from the trees as if by an unseen scythe. Men would duck behind an ancient oak for cover, only to have the bark explode into splinters beside their head. The orderly commands of Tryon's officers were a distant, chilling murmur, while the sounds on the regulator side were a desperate chorus of individual shouts, screams of pain, and cries of encouragement that were swallowed by the unending noise. When the smoke momentarily cleared, the field was a landscape of surreal and terrible images. A farmer's broad-brimmed hat lay upside down in the grass, a small dark hole punched through its crown. A heavy iron pitchfork stood upright, its tines buried in the soft earth, its owner nowhere to be seen. The disciplined red lines of the militia advanced slowly, relentlessly, a machine of death that seemed unstoppable, firing and reloading with a terrifying, practiced rhythm. After 2 agonizing hours, the sporadic resistance finally broke. The farmers, their courage no match for cannons and disciplined volleys, fled. They melted back into the deep woods from which they had come, their retreat covered by the smoke and confusion. And then, an even more terrifying sound descended upon the field: silence. Not the peaceful silence of the morning, but a heavy, profound stillness, broken only by the low moans of those who could not run. The battle was over. The rebellion was crushed. The spring grasses of Alamont's field were trampled and stained, littered with the abandoned tools and weapons of men who had gambled everything for justice and lost. The smoke slowly drifted away, revealing not a field of victory, but a scene of profound and brutal sorrow. The first American Revolution had ended not with a declaration, but with a slaughter. To understand a man like Governor William Tryon, you must understand that he never once saw the regulators as aggrieved citizens. In his mind, they were simply an infection. He was not a governor responding to a protest. He was a surgeon cutting out a tumor from the body of the colony. His entire career was built on the rigid structure of the British military, a world where orders were given and followed without question. To him, the farmer's defiance was not a plea for justice. It was a breakdown in the fundamental order of civilization itself, a direct and personal insult to his authority and the king's. Tryon's logic was cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of empathy. These were not men who had lost their farms. They were traitors who had defied the law. They were not fathers trying to feed their children. They were a rabble who had assaulted an officer of the crown. In his dispatches, he referred to them as banditti and insurgents. He believed, with an unshakable conviction, that the only way to deal with such a chaotic force was with overwhelming, brutal, and public displays of power. Mercy, in his view, would be interpreted as weakness, and weakness would only invite more chaos. The switch likely flipped in his mind the moment he heard the details of the Hillsborough riot. The image of Edmund Fanning, a man of his class, a Yale-educated official, being dragged from a judge's bench and beaten in the street by a mob of coarse, uneducated frontiersmen must have been horrifying to him. It was a vision of the world turned upside down. It was the peasants storming the castle. From that moment on, his response was not a political calculation, but a visceral, almost aristocratic rage. He wasn't just marching to restore order, He was marching to put these people back in their proper place. After the cannons fell silent at Alamance and the farmers had fled, Tryon likely felt not a shred of remorse, but a grim sense of satisfaction. The feeling would have been one of triumph, of order restored. As he rode across the silent, blood-soaked field, he wouldn't have seen the bodies of his fellow countrymen. He would have seen the evidence of a necessary and successful operation. The hanging of James Few on the battlefield without a trial was not an act of cruelty in his mind, but a necessary piece of political theatre. It was a clear, unambiguous message sent to every cabin in the backcountry. This is the price of defiance. This is the fate of those who challenge my authority. It was the cold, calculated logic of an empire that saw dissent not as a voice to be heard, but as a disease to be eradicated. When the last of the fleeing farmers had vanished into the woods, a new kind of silence fell on the Alamance battlefield. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness, thick with the smell of spent gunpowder and blood. Governor Tryon's victorious militia moved across the field, their discipline holding firm even in the face of the carnage they had wrought. They collected the wounded, counted the dead, and secured a handful of prisoners who had been too slow or too injured to escape. For them, it was a clean, decisive victory. For the backcountry, it was the beginning of a nightmare. For the surviving regulators, the fight was over, but the struggle for survival had just begun. They were no longer farmers or protesters, they were fugitives. They scattered into the familiar, dense wilderness of the Carolina Piedmont, the woods that had been their larder and their sanctuary now becoming their last hope of survival. Wounded men staggered through hidden ravines, while others made desperate journeys back to their homesteads, not to stay, but to grab a handful of supplies and whisper a frantic goodbye to their families before disappearing again into the shadows. They were hunted men in their own land. Tryon's vengeance was as swift as it was pitiless. He wanted to make an example, to burn the lesson of Alamance into the memory of the backcountry for a generation. Among the prisoners was a man named James Few, a simple carpenter who had been driven to rebellion. Without the pretense of a trial, without a prayer or a final word, Tryon ordered him hanged right there on the battlefield. His body was left dangling from an oak tree, a grotesque scarecrow meant to terrorize anyone who might still harbor defiant thoughts. He was a sacrifice, a bloody warning nailed to the barn door of the entire region. The battle was over, but the war on the regulator's spirit continued. Tryon turned his militia into an occupying army and unleashed them on the surrounding counties. They marched from farm to farm, a wave of red coats and cold steel, living off the land and terrorizing the populace. They were hunting for the regulator leaders, men like Herman Husband and James Hunter, and a handsome reward was offered for their capture, dead or alive. The soldiers interrogated wives and terrorized children, turning the once peaceful homesteads into places of fear and suspicion. This was not just a manhunt, it was a campaign of subjugation. Tryon issued a proclamation. Every man in the backcountry was to come forward and sign a binding oath of allegiance to the king and his government. To refuse was to be branded an outlaw. Over the next month, more than 6,000 farmers, their spirit broken and their leaders in hiding, were forced to make the humiliating journey to a militia camp to sign the document, effectively swearing loyalty to the very men who had crushed them. And as they did, Tryon's men were busy confiscating the property of known regulators, ensuring their families would face ruin and starvation. The ashes of Alamance had settled, and in the silence that followed, there was only fear and the cold grip of defeat. The smoke from the Battle of Alamance didn't just drift over the battlefield, it seeped into every cabin, every church, and every general store in the backcountry, poisoning the air between neighbors. The community, once united by common hardship, was now fractured, split by fear and the bitter question of who was right and who was wrong. A line had been drawn in the dirt, not by a surveyor, but by bloodshed, and every family was forced to choose which side they were on. The Presbyterian meeting houses, once the heart of the community, became cauldrons of quiet tension. Some preachers had thundered from the pulpit in support of the regulators, calling their cause a righteous one. Others, fearing the governor's wrath, now urged their congregations to submit to authority and pray for peace. Friendships that had been forged over decades of shared harvests and barn raisings now buckled under the weight of suspicion. Was the man who helped you clear your field last spring secretly reporting your movements to the militia? Was the family you shared bread with now loyal to the governor? A suffocating conspiracy of silence fell upon the region. The few who had witnessed the hangings or knew the hiding places of the regulator leaders were gripped by a primal fear. To speak the truth to the authorities was to risk being labeled a sympathizer, inviting the wrath of the occupying militia. But to stay silent was to betray their own conscience. Many chose a third option. They saw nothing, they heard nothing, they knew nothing. Their faces became blank masks, their conversations carefully pruned of any mention of the recent unpleasantness. It was a collective act of amnesia born of pure terror. Yet, even in this climate of fear, small acts of both courage and cowardice became the true measure of a person's soul. A brave farmer's wife would leave a basket of bread and salted meat at the edge of the woods, a silent signal to a husband or neighbor in hiding. A blacksmith, under the watchful eye of a militia patrol, would deliberately botch the shoeing of their horses, slowing them down just enough. But for every act of quiet defiance, there was an act of betrayal. A struggling farmer, tempted by the reward money or hoping to curry favor with the new powers, would lead a patrol to a hidden cabin. A merchant would provide a false alibi for a government loyalist, condemning an innocent man with his lie. The regulator war was no longer a battle fought with rifles on an open field. It had become a silent, vicious war fought with whispers, glances, and closed doors. It tore at the very fabric of the community, turning the backcountry into a place where the deepest loyalties were tested, and the truest nature of a man's heart was laid bare for all to see. With the rebellion crushed, the final act of Tryon's vengeance began, the hunt for the ringleaders. This was not a simple matter of law enforcement. It was a grim, relentless pursuit through the unforgiving Appalachian foothills. Tryon's militia, composed of Easterners who viewed the backcountry as a savage wilderness, formed the core of the posse. They were joined by a motley collection of local loyalists eager to prove their allegiance, and a few opportunistic bounty hunters who smelled blood money on the wind. Their mission was simple: bring back the leaders of the regulators, preferably in chains. The chase became a brutal contest between the hunters and the hunted, with the mountains themselves as the main character. The fugitives, men like James Hunter and the pamphleteer Herman Husband, knew this land like the back of their own hand. They knew every hidden valley, every secret pass, every cave where a man could disappear. They moved like ghosts through the dense forests, subsisting on wild berries and whatever game they could kill without a gunshot giving away their position. They were aided by a silent network of sympathetic farmers who would leave them food, warn them of patrols, and lead the militia on wild goose chases into impassable swamps. For the pursuers, the hunt was a descent into a green hell. The rugged terrain was their enemy. They were tormented by biting insects, venomous snakes, and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched from the shadows. Their brightly colored uniforms made them easy targets, and their ignorance of the land led them into ambushes and dead ends. More than one militia patrol found themselves hopelessly lost, forced to abandon the chase and struggle back to camp, humiliated and exhausted. The mountains, which had nurtured